The candle flame shook violently, though no window stood open in the room. Duke Alastair Ravenswood stood frozen at the edge of his study, staring at the empty chair across from him, the chair where his fiancée had once sat and laughed before her final breath left her body 3 years ago. His hands trembled, not from cold, but from memory. He had sworn on that terrible night that no woman would ever sit in that chair again. No woman would ever hold his hand again. No woman would ever love him again, because every woman who did seemed to die. The great house of Ravenswood stood on a hill above the small English town of Ashford Vale, its stone walls gray and unwelcoming, its gardens overgrown with weeds that no gardener dared to touch without the Duke's strict permission. Servants whispered about the house at night, when the wind howled through its corridors like something alive, something angry. They called it the Cursed House. They called Alastair the Cursed Duke. He was only 32 years old, yet he carried himself like a man twice his age, his dark hair streaked early with gray at the temples, his eyes hollow from nights without sleep. He had once been a bright young man, full of laughter, full of plans to marry and fill this house with children. That man had died the same night his fiancée did. What remained was a shell, a man who ran his estate through letters and mail stewards, who never allowed a woman past the front gates unless she was old, married, or a servant who kept her distance. The curse, as the townspeople called it, had begun 3 generations before him. His great-grandmother had died mysteriously the week after her wedding. His grandmother had lost her life in a fire the year she gave birth to his father. His own mother had drowned in the lake behind the house when Alastair was only 9 years old, on the very day she had promised to take him fishing. And then, when Alastair finally allowed himself to love again, his fiancée, a gentle woman named Margaret Fields, collapsed suddenly during their engagement dinner and never woke again. 4 women, 4 deaths, all connected to him by blood or by love. The pattern was too clear to ignore, too painful to explain away as simple bad luck. Alastair had consulted doctors, priests, and even scholars from London who studied old family curses, and none of them could explain what kept happening to the women of Ravenswood. All they could tell him was what he already knew in his bones: stay away from women, and they will live. So he did. For 10 long years, he built walls around himself higher than the stone walls of his own house. He dismissed every woman his aunt tried to introduce him to. He refused invitations to parties where young ladies might be present. He trained himself to flinch away from even accidental touch, turning his body sideways in crowded rooms, keeping his hands clasped behind his back at all times, as though his own fingers were dangerous weapons. His household staff understood this rule without needing to be told twice. His butler, a steady man named Edmund Price who had served the family for 20 years, made certain that only footmen and grooms attended to tasks that might bring them near the Duke. The cook, an elderly woman named Hilda, was permitted to remain only because she never once, in 15 years, had reason to touch her employer's hand. On this particular evening, as autumn wind rattled the windows of Ravenswood Hall, Alastair sat alone in his study reviewing accounts by candlelight, his quill moving in careful, practiced strokes. It was the anniversary of Margaret's death. Every year on this night, he allowed himself exactly 1 hour to remember her, and then he sealed the memory away again, locked it behind the same iron discipline that governed every part of his life. A knock came at the study door. Edmund entered, his expression carefully composed, though something in his eyes suggested unease. "Your Grace," he said, "there is a matter requiring your attention at the front gate." Alastair did not look up from his papers. "At this hour, send Peter to handle it. Whatever it is can wait until morning." "It concerns a traveler, Your Grace, a young woman. Her carriage has broken a wheel on the road below the hill and the storm is worsening. She has asked for shelter." Alastair's quill stopped moving. The word woman hung in the air between them like smoke that would not clear. He set the quill down slowly, his jaw tightening. "Give her coin for a room in the village inn," he said. "Send a groom to escort her there safely. That is all." Edmund hesitated, a rare thing for a man so composed. "Your Grace, The road to the village floods this time of year during storms such as this. The bridge may already be impassable. I fear sending her back out into the weather could put her in real danger. Outside, thunder cracked across the sky, loud enough to rattle the glass in the study windows. Rain began hammering against the roof in heavy, relentless sheets. Alistair rose from his desk and walked to the window, watching lightning split the darkness above the hills. Somewhere out there, on the flooded road, a stranger waited in the cold, unaware that the house she sought shelter in was cursed, unaware that the man who owned it had not allowed a woman to sleep beneath his roof in 10 years. Every instinct in him screamed to refuse. To protect her, he told himself, was to keep her far away from him entirely. But another thought crept in, colder and more practical. If he sent her back into a flooded road on a night like this, and something happened to her, would that not also be his fault? Would he not be trading one curse for another, this time earned through his own coldness rather than fate? He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the old, familiar weight settle over his chest, the weight of a man who could not win no matter which choice he made. "Bring her in," he said finally, his voice low. "But Edmund, listen carefully. She is to be given a room in the east wing, far from my own quarters. She is not to dine with me. She is not to be left alone with me under any circumstance. And under no condition, do you understand me, under no condition is she to touch my hand." Edmund bowed his head. "Understood, Your Grace. I will inform the staff." As the butler turned to leave, Alistair called after him, a strange urgency in his voice that surprised even himself. "Edmund, what is her name?" Edmund paused at the door. "I did not think to ask, Your Grace. Shall I find out?" Alistair looked back toward the window, toward the storm swallowing the hills whole. "No," he said quietly, "it does not matter. She will be gone by morning, once the road's clear." But even as he said the words, something in him doubted they were true. There was a strange stillness in the air, a feeling he had not experienced in years, since before Margaret, since before the curse had swallowed every soft feeling left inside him. It felt, absurdly, like the moment before a door opens onto a room he had long ago locked and sealed. He sat back down at his desk, forcing his attention onto the account books in front of him, though the numbers blurred meaninglessly on the page. Somewhere in the house, he could hear the faint commotion of servants moving quickly, doors opening, a woman's voice, muffled and unfamiliar, thanking someone for their kindness. The voice was warm, carrying an accent from somewhere in the north, gentle but unafraid, the voice of someone unbothered by the grandness or the gloom of the house around her. Alistair gripped his quill so tightly, it nearly snapped in his fingers. 10 years of discipline told him to remain in this study until she was safely tucked away in the east wing, far from his path. 10 years of guilt told him that even breathing the same air as a woman under his roof was an unforgivable risk. And yet, for reasons he could not name, he found himself rising from his chair and walking toward the study door, drawn by something stronger than fear, something he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten it existed. Curiosity. He opened the door just enough to see down the long hallway, where Edmund was leading a soaked, shivering stranger toward the staircase. A woman wrapped in a borrowed cloak far too large for her frame, her hair dark and dripping with rainwater, her chin lifted despite her exhaustion, as though she refused to let the storm or the house or anything else defeat her. She turned as if sensing eyes upon her, and for one long, unbearable moment, her gaze met his across the shadowed hallway. Alistair stepped back immediately, closing the door with more force than he intended, his heart pounding in a way it had not pounded in 10 long years. He told himself it was nothing, a stranger, a guest for one night, gone by morning. But the storm outside showed no sign of ending, and neither, he suspected, did whatever had just begun the moment their eyes met. He returned to his desk and sat down heavily, pressing his palms flat against the cool wood surface, trying to steady his breathing. For 10 years he had trained his body to remain calm around danger, to treat every woman's presence as a threat to be managed rather than a person to be known. Yet the sound of her voice down the hallway had undone something in him within seconds, something he had spent a decade building brick by careful brick. He told himself it meant nothing. Strangers passed through Ravenswood Hall rarely, but they did pass through: delivery men, traveling merchants, the occasional lost hunter seeking directions back to the main road. None of them had ever stayed. None of them had ever needed to. This woman would be no different. Come morning, once the rain stopped and the roads dried enough for travel, Edmund would arrange a carriage to take her wherever she needed to go, and Alistair would return to the quiet, careful rhythm of his solitary life. And yet he found himself listening for sounds down the hallway long after the house had gone quiet. He heard Hilda's footsteps carrying a tray of tea and bread toward the east wing. He heard the soft click of a door closing. He heard, faintly, the storm easing into a steady, gentler rain, as though even the sky itself had grown tired of its own fury. Alistair did not sleep that night. He sat in his study long after the candle burned low, staring at the chair across from him, the chair that had remained empty for 3 years. And for the first time since Margaret's death, he found himself wondering not about the past, but about the woman sleeping under his roof, a stranger whose name he did not know, whose face he had glimpsed only for a single unguarded moment, and whose voice had somehow reached through 10 years of silence to remind him that he was still, despite everything, a man capable of feeling something other than grief. He did not know her name yet. He told himself firmly that he did not need to know it. But as the first gray light of morning began creeping through the study windows, and the storm finally broke into stillness, Alistair Ravenswood realized with quiet dread that some part of him was already hoping the roads would stay flooded a little while longer. The scream tore through the east wing before dawn had fully broken, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet halls of Ravenswood like a blade. Elena Whitmore sat bolt upright in the unfamiliar bed, her heart slamming against her ribs, certain for one terrifying moment that the scream had come from her own throat. It had not. It had come from somewhere below, somewhere near the kitchens, and it was followed immediately by shouting voices and the sound of running feet. She threw off the borrowed blanket and rushed to the door, still dressed in the plain nightgown Hilda had lent her the night before, her dark hair loose and tangled from restless sleep. The hallway outside was already filling with smoke, thin gray tendrils curling along the ceiling, carrying with them the sharp, acrid smell of burning wood. "Fire!" someone shouted from below. "Fire in the kitchen wing." Elena did not hesitate. Growing up the daughter of a country doctor, she had learned from childhood that panic killed faster than flames did. She pressed the back of her hand against her door before opening it fully, found it cool, and stepped out into the smoke-filled corridor, pulling the collar of her nightgown up over her nose and mouth. Servants rushed past her in every direction, some carrying buckets of water, others shouting instructions that seemed to contradict one another. An older woman, the cook Elena had met briefly the night before, stumbled through the smoke coughing violently, her apron singed at the edges. "Where is everyone going?" Elena called out, grabbing the woman's arm to steady her. "Is anyone still inside?" The Duke, the cook, gasped between coughs. He went back in, said something about papers, important papers in the East study. He wouldn't leave them, the fool man, he never listens. Elena's stomach dropped. "Which way?" she demanded. "Show me which way." The cook pointed a shaking finger down a smoke-choked hallway before collapsing against a nearby wall, exhausted from the smoke already in her lungs. Elena did not wait for further explanation. She tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her nightgown, soaked it quickly in a nearby water basin left over from the previous night, and pressed it against her face before running directly into the smoke. She had never met this Duke. She knew nothing of him beyond the strange coldness in his eyes when their gazes had briefly crossed the evening before, a coldness that had struck her even then as more sorrowful than unkind. But she knew, without needing to think about it, that she could not stand by while a man burned alive over paperwork, however important it might seem to him in that panicked moment. The heat grew fiercer as she moved deeper into the east wing, the wooden paneling along the walls already beginning to blacken and crack. She found him in a small study near the kitchens, coughing violently, one arm wrapped around a heavy leather-bound ledger, the other braced against a bookshelf that had begun to lean dangerously toward the doorway, flames licking hungrily along its lower shelves. "Leave it," Alina shouted over the roar of the fire. "It is not worth your life." Alistair turned toward her voice, his eyes wide with shock at finding her there, of all people, in the middle of the burning room. "Get out," he ordered, his voice hoarse from smoke. "This is not your concern." "It became my concern the moment I heard you might die in here," Alina shot back, already moving toward him despite the heat searing her skin. The bookshelf groaned above them, timbers cracking under the strain of the fire eating through its supports. Alistair saw it first, the exact moment the shelf began to topple, aimed directly toward where Alina now stood only a few feet away from him. There was no time for careful thought, no time to remember the rule he had guarded so fiercely for 10 years. His body moved on pure instinct, lunging forward and shoving her out of the shelf's path, sending them both stumbling toward the doorway as burning wood crashed down exactly where she had been standing seconds before. They hit the floor of the hallway together, coughing, disoriented, the heat behind them roaring louder as the study collapsed further inward. And in the chaos, in the desperate scramble to get further from the flames, Alina's hand found his, gripping it tightly as she pulled him upright and dragged him bodily down the corridor toward the fresh air of the entrance hall. Alistair felt it the instant her fingers closed around his, a jolt that had nothing to do with the fire behind them. For 10 years he had flinched from every accidental brush of contact, certain that a woman's touch upon his skin was a sentence of death waiting to be carried out. Now her hand gripped his firmly, urgently, pulling him toward safety rather than toward doom, and he found himself too stunned by the sensation to pull away, even as every instinct screamed that he should. They burst out into the courtyard together, gasping for clean air, smoke staining both their faces gray. And still, even as servants rushed toward them with water and blankets, Alina did not let go of his hand until she was certain he was steady on his feet. "Are you hurt?" she asked immediately, turning to examine him with the same brisk efficiency she might have used on any patient, entirely unbothered by his rank or his reputation. "Can you breathe properly? Does your chest hurt?" Alistair stared at her, at the soot smudged across her cheek, at the fierce concern in her eyes for a man she had known less than a full day, and found himself unable to answer for a long moment. He was not hurt, not in his body at least. But something inside his chest had shifted violently, some carefully constructed wall cracking under pressure it had not felt in years. "I am fine," he managed finally, his voice rough. "You should not have come back in, it was reckless." Alina raised an eyebrow, wiping soot from her own face with the back of her sleeve. "And leaving a man to burn over a ledger would have been sensible," she countered, a hint of dry humor slipping into her tone despite the danger they had just escaped. "Forgive me for choosing recklessness over watching someone die." Around them, the household staff worked quickly to bring the fire under control, forming a chain of buckets from the courtyard well, Edmund directing the effort with practiced calm despite the visible alarm still written across his face. Within the hour, the flames were extinguished, leaving behind only a blackened, smoke-stained wing, and the acrid smell of destruction hanging over the entire east side of the house. Alistair stood apart from the activity, staring down at his own hand, the hand Alina had gripped so tightly only minutes before. Nothing had happened. She had touched him, held his hand through fire and smoke, and nothing terrible had followed. No collapse, no sudden illness, no tragedy waiting in the wings, just the two of them standing in a soot-stained courtyard alive. He did not know what to make of it. 10 years of grief and careful discipline told him it was only a matter of time. That disaster merely waited longer this time, biding its moment before striking her down as it had struck down every woman before her. But another part of him, a part he had thought long dead, whispered a different possibility entirely, one he was almost afraid to consider. What if the curse had never been real at all? Edmund approached him once the fire was fully contained, his face streaked with ash, his composure returning slowly. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "we believe a fallen candle in the kitchen ignited the curtains near the pantry. It spread quickly through the dry wood paneling before anyone noticed. Fortunately, the damage appears contained to the east wing alone." Alistair nodded absently, his attention still fixed on Alina, who had moved to help tend to a young kitchen maid with a minor burn on her arm, speaking to the frightened girl in a low, soothing voice, her hands steady and confident despite everything that had just happened. There was something remarkable about her calm in the face of chaos, something that made him want, despite every warning bell ringing in his mind, to know more about who she truly was. "Your Grace," Edmund said again, drawing his attention back. "Given the damage to the east wing, the guest room we prepared for the young lady is no longer habitable. Shall I arrange quarters for her in the village until the road's clear enough for proper travel?" Alistair hesitated, watching Alina finish wrapping a clean cloth around the maid's burned arm with careful, practiced hands. The old rule rose up in his mind immediately, the rule he had followed without exception for a decade. Send her away. Keep the distance. Protect her by keeping her far from him and everything cursed about his family name. But he thought, too, of her hand gripping his through smoke and fire, of the strange and undeniable fact that nothing terrible had happened. Not yet. Not in the way it always had before. He thought of 10 years spent alone in a house that felt more like a tomb with every passing season, and he found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, unwilling to simply follow the old fear without question. "No," he said slowly, surprising even himself with the decision. "The roads are likely still too dangerous for travel today, given the storm's damage. She may stay in the West Wing until it is safe for her to continue her journey." Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly, though he was too well trained to voice his surprise aloud. "As you wish, Your Grace," he said simply, before moving off to arrange the new accommodations. Alistair remained standing in the courtyard a while longer, watching smoke drift lazily from the ruined east wing into the pale morning sky. Watching Alina laugh gently at something the young maid said despite the girl's tears. Watching her move through his household with an ease and warmth that his silent, careful staff had not seen within these walls in a very long time. He did not understand yet what was happening to him, why a decade of careful discipline had cracked so easily in the space of a single terrifying morning. But he understood, with a certainty that unsettled him deeply, that keeping Alina Whitmore at arm's length was going to prove far more difficult than he had ever imagined the night before, when he had believed she would simply be gone by morning, forgotten as easily as any other passing stranger. She was not gone. In some quiet, long-buried part of him, a part that still remembered how to hope, was glad of it. Later that afternoon, once the smoke had cleared and the household had settled into an uneasy calm, Alistair found himself walking the garden path behind the house, a place he rarely visited except when he needed silence to think. To his surprise, he found Alina already there, sitting on a stone bench near the overgrown rose beds, her borrowed dress still smudged faintly with soot despite Hilda's best efforts to clean it. She did not rise or curtsy when she saw him approach, which struck him as unusual given his rank, though he found he did not mind it in the least. Instead, she simply shifted slightly on the bench, making room for him to sit if he chose, an invitation offered without pressure or expectation. "Your gardener has given up on these roses," she observed, gesturing toward the tangled, thorny branches surrounding them. "That seems a shame. They could still be beautiful with a little attention." Alistair remained standing a moment longer, studying her profile in the pale afternoon light. "No one tends this garden anymore," he admitted quietly. "I asked the staff to leave it be some years ago." "Why?" she asked, turning to look up at him directly, her gaze open and unafraid in a way few people dared to be around him anymore. He considered lying, offering some polite excuse about expense or practicality. Instead, for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself telling her the truth. "My mother loved this garden," he said. "After she died, I could not bear to watch anyone else care for it in her place. It seemed easier to let it go wild than to see someone else's hands where hers had been." Alina was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an expression that held no pity, only understanding. "That is not the same as letting it go," she said gently. "That is simply guarding something precious in the only way you knew how. There is a difference." Something in her words struck a chord deep within him, a chord that had gone untouched for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. He finally sat down on the far end of the bench. keeping a careful distance between them, old habits still holding firm even as everything else in him seemed to be shifting. "You are not afraid of me," he said after a moment, more statement than question. "Most people in this county speak of this house and of me with a great deal of caution." Alina smiled faintly, tucking a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. "I grew up in a house full of sickness and grief," she said. "My father was a doctor. I learned very young that fear rarely helps anyone survive anything. It only makes the surviving harder." Alastair studied her for a long moment, the fading afternoon light catching gold in her dark hair, and felt, despite every warning bell still ringing faintly in the back of his mind, a strange and unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him, the first he had known in 10 long years. He did not yet know how dangerous that peace might prove to be, nor how quickly it could be tested by forces neither of them could yet foresee. But in that quiet garden, beside a woman who refused to be frightened away, Alastair allowed himself, just for a moment, to imagine what it might feel like to be an ordinary man again, one capable of sitting beside someone he was beginning, against every instinct, to care for. The letter arrived 3 weeks later, sealed with black wax and addressed in handwriting Alastair had not seen in over a decade, handwriting that made his blood run cold the instant he recognized it. He stood in his study, the morning sun streaming weakly through rain-streaked windows, and stared at his own name written across the envelope in a hand belonging to a man he had believed gone from his life forever. Gerald Ravenswood, his father's younger brother, disowned and exiled from the family estate 15 years earlier following a scandal so severe it had never been spoken of openly within these walls. Alastair had been a boy of 17 when his uncle vanished from Ravenswood Hall in disgrace, and he had not heard the man's name spoken aloud since his own father's funeral 8 years ago. He broke the seal with unsteady hands and read the brief, carefully worded message inside. Gerald claimed to be dying, requesting one final visit to the family estate before the end, appealing to whatever remained of family loyalty between them despite the years of silence. Alastair read the letter twice, searching for the falseness he was certain must be hidden somewhere within the polished, sorrowful language, but found nothing definitive enough to refuse the request outright. 3 weeks had passed since the fire in the East Wing, 3 weeks during which Alina Whitmore had remained at Ravenswood Hall, ostensibly waiting for the roads to fully clear and for a suitable escort to be arranged for her journey home. In truth, both of them knew the roads had cleared within the first week. Neither had spoken openly of why she remained, though the reason had grown clearer with each passing day they spent together, walking the garden paths, sharing quiet meals once Alastair finally relented and allowed her to join him at his own table, discovering in one another a companionship neither had expected to find. Nothing terrible had happened. No sudden illness, no tragic accident, nothing to confirm the fear that had governed Alastair's entire adult life. He had begun, cautiously, dangerously, to believe that perhaps the curse had never been real magic at all, but simply a devastating series of coincidences that had convinced a grieving family to see patterns where none truly existed. He found Alina in the library that afternoon, curled into a window seat with one of his late mother's books open across her lap, sunlight catching the soft curve of her face as she read. She looked up when he entered, her expression shifting immediately to concern at whatever she saw written across his own features. "What has happened?" she asked, closing the book gently and setting it aside. Alastair handed her the letter without a word, watching her expression carefully as she read through Gerald's careful, pleading sentences. When she finished, she looked up at him, her brow furrowed thoughtfully. "You do not trust him," she said. "It was not a question." "I have not spoken to my uncle in 15 years, Alastair replied, moving to stand near the fireplace, his back to the cold, unlit hearth. "He left this family in disgrace after attempting to alter my grandfather's will in his own favor. My father cut him off entirely, and rightfully so. Now, suddenly, after all these years, he claims to be dying and wishes to reconcile." "Perhaps he genuinely is dying," Alina suggested gently. "People often seek to mend old wounds when they believe their time is running short." "Perhaps," Alastair agreed, though his voice carried little conviction. Or perhaps he has heard rumors that the Ravenswood curse may finally be broken, and wishes to see for himself whether the woman staying beneath this roof survives the encounter. Alina's eyes widened slightly at the implication, though she did not look frightened, only thoughtful, turning the possibility over carefully in her mind the way she seemed to approach every problem, with calm, deliberate reason rather than panic. "What reason would he have to wish me harm?" she asked. "He does not even know me." "He does not need to know you personally," Alistair said grimly. "He need only know that you exist, that you have remained here for weeks without incident, and that your continued survival threatens a story this family has told itself for 3 generations. If the curse is proven false, certain old claims regarding inheritance and estate management, claims my uncle once tried and failed to press, might resurface with renewed strength." Alina set the letter down on the small table beside the window seat, her expression sharpening with the same practical focus Alistair had first noticed the morning of the fire. "Then we must be careful," she said simply. "But I do not think hiding from him will serve either of us well. If he comes here with harmful intentions, better to know it clearly than to wonder and wait." Alistair studied her for a long moment, struck once again by her steady courage in the face of danger that would have sent most people fleeing in the opposite direction. "You are certain you wish to remain?" he asked quietly. "I would understand if you chose to return home now, before he arrives. I could arrange transport within the week." Alina rose from the window seat and crossed the room to stand before him, close enough that he could see the small flecks of amber within her dark eyes, close enough that his carefully guarded discipline wavered dangerously once again. "I am not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Not because of stubbornness, but because I have come to care what happens to you, Alistair Ravenswood, more than I expected to when I first arrived soaked and shivering at your gate 3 weeks ago." The words settled over him like warmth spreading through cold, long neglected rooms. He had not allowed himself to hope for such honesty from another person in 10 long years, had not believed himself capable of receiving it without flinching away in fear. Yet here she stood, offering her presence freely, fully aware of the danger it might invite, and asking nothing from him in return except the chance to remain nearby. "I care for you as well," he admitted, the words rough and unfamiliar in his mouth after so long spent locking such feelings away. "More than I know how to properly express. But Alina, if anything were to happen to you because of my family's history, I do not believe I could survive it a second time." "Then we shall simply have to make certain nothing does," she replied, reaching up to gently touch his cheek, her fingers cool against skin that suddenly felt far too warm. "And if your uncle arrives with harmful intentions hidden behind polished words, we shall face that together, rather than you facing it alone as you have faced everything else for far too long." Alistair caught her hand against his cheek, holding it there for a long, quiet moment, memorizing the sensation of simple, uncomplicated touch freely given rather than feared. For the first time since his mother's death, he allowed himself to imagine a future that did not consist entirely of solitary rooms and careful distance. A future that might, against every dark expectation he had carried for a decade, actually include another person standing beside him. Gerald Ravenswood arrived 4 days later, his carriage rolling up the long drive toward Ravenswood Hall beneath a gray, overcast sky that seemed to match the tension already gathering within the house. Alistair stood at the top of the front steps to receive him, Alina positioned carefully a few steps behind, close enough to observe but distant enough to avoid drawing immediate attention. Gerald emerged from the carriage slowly, leaning heavily on a walking cane, his once dark hair now entirely gray, his face thinner and more weathered than Alistair remembered from childhood. If this frailty was performance, it was a convincing one, though Alistair reminded himself firmly that 15 years and whatever illness truly plagued the man could easily account for such changes without any deception required. "Nephew," Gerald said, his voice carrying a warmth that felt, to Alistair's careful ear, slightly too practiced to be entirely genuine. "You have grown into quite the master of this house. Your father would be proud, I think, despite everything that passed between us." Uncle Alastair replied evenly, offering a formal bow rather than an embrace. Welcome back to Ravenswood Hall. I trust your journey was not too taxing, given your condition. Gerald's gaze drifted past his nephew toward Alina, lingering there with an expression Alastair could not quite read, curiosity perhaps, or something more calculating hidden beneath a pleasant, grandfatherly smile. "And who is this lovely young lady?" he asked, his tone light and conversational, though something in his eyes remained sharp and assessing. "This is Miss Alina Whitmore," Alastair said carefully, keeping his voice steady despite the protective instinct rising sharply within him. "A guest of the household." "A guest," Gerald repeated, his smile widening slightly. "How unusual, given the reputation this house has carried for so many years. I confess I am surprised to find a young lady residing here at all, nephew, given everything our family has endured." The comment hung in the air, laden with implications Alastair chose not to address directly. "Times change, uncle," he said simply. "Shall we go inside? I imagine you would appreciate rest after such a long journey." As they moved through the entrance hall toward the drawing room where refreshments had been prepared, Alina fell into step beside Alastair, her expression composed but her eyes watchful, missing nothing of the careful tension threading through every polite exchange between uncle and nephew. Later, once Gerald had been settled into guest quarters to rest, she found Alastair alone in his study, staring at the old family portrait hanging above the fireplace, a painting of his grandfather and great-uncle standing side by side decades before the scandal that had torn their branch of the family apart. "He is not here simply to reconcile," Alina said quietly, closing the study door behind her. "I could see it in his eyes when he looked at me. He was measuring something, calculating some advantage he believes my presence here might offer him." Alastair nodded grimly, not turning from the portrait. "My father once told me that Gerald tried to convince our grandfather, in his final illness, that the family curse could only be lifted by transferring the estate entirely into Gerald's hands, away from what he called a bloodline too tainted to safely continue. Grandfather refused, and Gerald's scheme, along with his forged documents supporting the claim, was discovered shortly afterward. That was when he was cast out." "And now," Alina said slowly, piecing the puzzle together with the same careful logic she applied to every problem, "if the curse proves false while you remain the master of this estate, his old argument loses all remaining power. But if something were to happen to convince the world the curse remains real, particularly something that could be blamed on your own judgment in allowing a woman to remain here against family tradition, his claim might find new life." "Precisely," Alastair said grimly, finally turning to face her. "Which is why, Alina, I need you to be more careful than ever during his stay. Do not eat or drink anything not first tasted by Hilda or myself. Do not walk the grounds alone after dark. And if you sense danger of any kind, however small it may seem, come to me immediately." Alina crossed the room and took both his hands in hers, her grip firm and steady despite the fear that flickered briefly across her expression, before she mastered it once again. "We will get through this together," she said firmly. "Whatever he is planning, we will face it with clear eyes and careful minds, not fear. You have spent 10 years running from shadows that were never truly chasing you. I do not intend to let a man like Gerald Ravenswood convince either of us to start running again now." Alastair looked down at their joined hands, remembering with sudden, vivid clarity the moment 3 weeks ago when her hand had first closed around his through smoke and flame, pulling him toward safety rather than doom. He had spent a decade believing that any woman's touch upon his skin was a countdown toward tragedy. Now, standing in his study with danger gathering once again at his own front door, he found himself believing something entirely different. That perhaps her hand in his was not a curse being renewed, but the very thing that might finally break it for good. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, meeting her steady gaze, "I am glad you did not leave when I offered you the chance." Alina smiled faintly, though worry still lingered clearly behind her eyes. "So am I," she said. "Now, let us see what your uncle truly wants from this house before he has the chance to take it from us both." That evening, Dinner in the great hall proceeded with the stiff formality of two men circling one another carefully, each waiting for the other to reveal his true purpose. Gerald spoke at length about his years abroad, of a modest life spent in France following his exile, of illness that had crept upon him slowly over the past 2 years and now left him, in his own words, with little time remaining to make peace with the family he had wronged so long ago. Alina watched him throughout the meal, saying little herself, content to observe the careful dance between uncle and nephew. She noticed the way Gerald's cane rested against his chair rather than truly bearing his weight when he rose briefly to admire the old family portraits lining the hall. She noticed how his supposedly frail hands moved with surprising steadiness when he lifted his wine glass. Small details, easily dismissed individually, but together they painted a picture that troubled her deeply. After dinner concluded, Gerald requested a private word with his nephew, and Alina excused herself to the drawing room, though she remained close enough to the study door to catch fragments of the conversation that followed, her natural caution overriding any guilt she might have felt about listening. "I have heard talk in the village," Gerald's voice carried faintly through the heavy oak door, "talk of a fire in this very house not long ago. And talk, too, of a young woman who has remained here for weeks despite our family's well-known history. Tell me honestly, nephew, are you not afraid of what continuing down this path might bring upon her?" "I am aware of the risks," Alastair's voice replied, carefully controlled. "That is my concern to weigh, uncle, not yours." Of course," Gerald said smoothly, though something in his tone suggested he did not consider the matter settled at all. "I only worry for you, nephew, as any uncle would. This family has suffered so much loss already. I would hate to see history repeat itself once more, especially when there remain other paths available to secure this estate's future without such risk." "Other paths," Alastair repeated, his voice sharpening with suspicion. "Speak plainly, uncle. What is it you have truly come here to propose?" There was a pause, long enough that Alina found herself holding her breath despite the door separating her from the conversation. When Gerald spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier warmth, revealing something colder and more calculating underneath. "I have drafted a proposal," he said, "for you to consider carefully. A transfer of certain estate management responsibilities into my care, given my experience and my desire to see this family's legacy protected properly, free from the danger that continuing your current path might invite. I would remain here to guide you, nephew, to help ensure that no further tragedy befalls this house or anyone within it. Consider it not as a challenge to your authority, but as protection, offered freely by family who cares for your well-being." Alina felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the drawing-room fire nearby. This was precisely what Alastair had feared, dressed up in gentle, caring language, designed to make the offer sound like concern, rather than the calculated scheme it truly was. "I will consider your proposal," Alastair said finally, his voice carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "Though I make no promises regarding my answer, uncle. This estate has been managed under my authority alone for 8 years, and I see no immediate reason to change that arrangement now." "Of course," Gerald replied, his warmth returning as smoothly as it had disappeared moments before. "Take whatever time you require. I only ask that you consider carefully what continued risk might cost you and everyone you care for within these walls." The conversation shifted afterward to lighter topics, old family memories and news from the village, and Alina retreated quietly back into the drawing room before either man could discover she had been listening at all. When Alastair finally joined her there later that evening, his expression was grave, carrying the weight of a threat now clearly understood, if not yet fully confirmed. "He wants control of the estate," she said quietly before he could speak. "Dressed up as concern for our safety, but control nonetheless." Alastair's eyes widened briefly with surprise, though he did not ask how she knew. "You heard," he said simply. "I did," she admitted without apology. "And Alastair, I do not believe for one moment that his concern for your safety, or mine, is genuine. A man planning to protect this family would not have arrived with such carefully prepared proposals already drafted and ready for your signature." This was planned long before he ever wrote that letter requesting reconciliation. Alistair sank into the chair across from her, running a hand wearily through his dark hair. "I fear you are right," he said, "which means we must proceed with extreme caution from this point forward. If he cannot obtain the estate through simple persuasion, I worry what lengths he might go to next in pursuit of what he believes should rightfully be his." Alina reached across the space between them and took his hand firmly in hers, offering silent reassurance in the gesture itself. "Whatever he attempts," she said quietly, "we will face it together, exactly as we agreed. He may have spent 15 years planning this moment, but he has clearly underestimated both of us in the process." Alistair looked down at their joined hands, drawing strength from her steady presence. In a way, he had not believed himself capable of relying upon another person for longer than he could remember. Outside, the wind picked up once more against the windows, carrying with it the distant sound of thunder rolling across the hills, as though the storm that had first brought Alina to his door was returning now to test whether the fragile peace they had built together could truly withstand whatever darkness Gerald Ravenswood had brought back into this house alongside him. The stable burned to the ground 2 nights later, and this time, no candle left carelessly burning could explain it. Alistair stood in the pale gray light of early morning, staring at the smoldering ruins where 12 horses had been safely stabled the evening before. All of them thankfully led to safety in time, though the building itself was beyond saving. The head groom, a steady man named Peter who had worked at Ravenswood Hall since boyhood, approached with soot on his hands and something troubled written across his weathered face. "Your Grace," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only Alistair could hear him, "I found this near the stable's east wall, before the fire fully took hold. Someone had piled dry straw against the outer boards, far more than would naturally gather there on its own, and there was a smell of lamp oil, unmistakable once I got close enough to notice it." Alistair's jaw tightened as he absorbed the implication. Someone had deliberately set the fire. "Show no one else what you found, Peter," he said quietly. "Not yet. I need to think carefully about how to proceed." "Understood, Your Grace," Peter replied, though his eyes carried clear worry as he glanced briefly toward the main house, toward the wing where Gerald Ravenswood currently slept undisturbed by the commotion outside. Alistair found Alina already awake when he returned to the house, standing at a window overlooking the ruined stable, her expression grave. She turned as he entered, crossing the room quickly to meet him. "This was no accident, was it?" she said, reading the confirmation in his expression before he even spoke a word. "No," he admitted grimly. Peter found evidence of deliberate arson near the east wall. Straw and lamp oil, positioned carefully to ensure the fire would spread quickly. Alina's face paled slightly, though her voice remained steady. "Your uncle," she said. "It must be him. Who else would benefit from chaos and destruction within this household, especially so soon after his proposal was refused?" "I have not yet refused his proposal outright," Alistair reminded her. "I told him only that I would consider it, which means, if this is indeed his doing, he grows impatient waiting for an answer he suspects will not favor him. Or," Alina said slowly, working through the possibility carefully, "he intends to create enough danger and instability within this household that you will feel forced to accept his offer of protection, believing it the only way to prevent further harm from befalling anyone here, myself included." Alistair's hands clenched at his sides at the thought. "If that is his design," he said grimly, "then he has badly misjudged how I intend to respond to threats against the people under my protection. I will not be frightened into surrendering this estate to a man who would burn down my own stables and endanger innocent lives simply to further his ambitions." They spent the following days in careful, quiet observation, watching Gerald's movements without revealing their suspicions directly, hoping to catch some clear proof of his involvement before confronting him openly. Edmund, informed discreetly of the situation, assigned trusted footmen to monitor the guest wing during evening hours, while Peter kept careful watch over what remained of the stable grounds each night. Gerald, for his part, played the role of concerned relative with practiced skill, expressing shock and sympathy over the stable fire, offering to help fund repairs from his own modest savings. A gesture Alastair politely declined, while privately noting how quickly and generously the offer had come, almost as though prepared in advance. It was Alina who finally uncovered the thread that began unraveling Gerald's careful performance. Wandering the grounds one afternoon under the guise of simply enjoying fresh air, she encountered a young stable boy near the ruins, a boy no older than 14 who had worked briefly under Peter's supervision before the fire. The boy, nervous and hesitant, revealed that a stranger had approached him the week before Gerald's arrival, offering payment in exchange for information about the household's routines and the exact location where the horses were stabled each night. Did this stranger give a name? Alina asked gently, crouching down to the boy's level to ease his obvious anxiety. No, miss, the boy admitted, twisting his cap nervously between his hands. But he wore a signet ring, gold with a black stone set into it, same as the ring I saw on the old gentleman's hand at dinner 2 nights past, when cook sent me to deliver extra bread to the guest table. Alina's pulse quickened at this new piece of evidence, though she kept her expression carefully neutral for the boy's sake. "Thank you for telling me this," she said kindly. "You have done nothing wrong by speaking honestly now. Would you be willing to tell the Duke exactly what you just told me?" The boy hesitated, clearly frightened, but eventually nodded, and Alina walked with him back toward the main house, her mind already racing ahead to how this new information might finally give Alastair the proof he needed to confront his uncle directly. That evening, in the privacy of the study, the stable boy repeated his account to Alastair directly, describing the stranger's payment and the description of the signet ring in careful, halting detail. Once the boy had been sent back to the kitchens with reassurances and a small coin for his honesty, Alastair sat heavily in his chair, processing the weight of what they now knew. "It is not absolute proof," he said slowly, though the anger simmering beneath his controlled voice was unmistakable. Many men might own similar rings, but combined with his sudden proposal, his suspiciously generous offer to fund repairs, and his history of forged documents 15 years ago, I find it difficult to imagine any other explanation that fits so neatly. "What will you do?" Alina asked, watching him carefully. "I will confront him directly," Alastair said, rising from his chair with renewed purpose. "Tomorrow, in the presence of witnesses, so there can be no confusion later about what is said between us. If he denies it, I will have Peter and Edmund search his belongings for further evidence, and if he refuses to leave willingly once confronted, I will have him removed from this estate by force if necessary." Alina crossed the room and stood before him, her expression a mixture of pride and lingering worry. "Be careful," she said softly. "A man desperate enough to burn down a stable to further his ambitions may prove dangerous when finally cornered and exposed. Do not underestimate what he might attempt next." "I do not intend to," Alastair replied, reaching up to gently brush a strand of hair back from her face, a small, tender gesture that had become increasingly natural between them over the past weeks despite the danger surrounding them. "I only wish I had confronted him the moment he arrived, rather than allowing this uncertainty to continue as long as it has. Every day he remains under this roof is another day you remain in danger because of my family's unfinished quarrels." "You are not responsible for his choices," Alina said firmly, taking his hands in hers. "Only for your own. And your choice, from the very beginning, has been to protect the people around you rather than hide from the world out of fear. That is nothing to apologize for, Alastair. That is exactly the kind of man I have come to admire during these past weeks together." Her words settled something deep within him, quieting the guilt that had begun creeping back into his thoughts since the stable fire first revealed the danger they now faced together. He drew her closer, resting his forehead gently against hers, drawing strength from her steady presence in a way he had once believed himself incapable of allowing. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I am grateful you did not let fear keep you from staying by my side these past weeks. 10 years of solitude taught me many things, but none of them prepared me for how much stronger I would feel simply knowing you stood beside me now, facing this threat together rather than alone." Alina smiled softly, though worry still lingered clearly behind her eyes as she considered what tomorrow's confrontation might bring. "Then let us make certain we are ready for whatever he attempts next," she said quietly. "Together, exactly as we promised each other from the beginning." Outside, the wind stirred gently through the ruined timbers of the burned stable, carrying with it the faint, lingering smell of smoke that still hung over the grounds days after the fire had been extinguished. A quiet reminder that the danger threatening them both had not yet fully revealed how far it was truly willing to go. Sleep did not come easily to Alistair that night. He lay awake long after the house had quieted, turning over every detail of the stable boy's testimony, every carefully worded sentence Gerald had offered since his arrival, searching for the moment when concern had first begun masking calculation. He thought of his father, who had trusted Gerald once, long ago, before discovering the forged documents that ended their relationship permanently. He wondered whether his father had felt this same slow, creeping dread as the truth revealed itself piece by piece, or whether the betrayal had struck all at once, sudden and complete. Near midnight, restless and unable to settle his thoughts, Alistair rose and made his way quietly through the darkened house, drawn by habit toward the study where he had spent so many solitary nights over the past decade. He found the door already slightly ajar, lamplight flickering faintly from within, and for one alarmed moment feared an intruder had entered his private sanctuary. Easing the door open further, he found Alina instead, seated at his desk, carefully studying a stack of old family documents she had apparently borrowed from the estate archive. "I could not sleep either," she admitted, glancing up at him without embarrassment at being found there uninvited. "I thought perhaps the answer to some of this might lie buried in your family's older records. Something from before Gerald's exile that might explain his true motives more clearly than mere ambition alone." Alistair crossed the room and sat across from her, curious despite his exhaustion. "Have you found anything of use?" he asked. "Perhaps," she said slowly, turning one yellowed page toward him. "This is a copy of your grandfather's original will, before the amendments that followed the scandal. It seems Gerald was not simply seeking control of the estate for its own sake. There was a debt, incurred years before his exile, owed to men in London whose patience, from what I can gather in these margin notes your grandfather made, was already running dangerously thin even then. If that debt remained unpaid all these years, with interest accumulating, the sum by now could be substantial enough to explain a truly desperate man's willingness to take extreme risks." Alistair studied the faded handwriting carefully, a memory stirring faintly of overheard conversations from his childhood, adults speaking in hushed, worried tones about money owed and reputations at stake. "It would explain a great deal," he admitted slowly. "A man drowning in debt might see inheriting even partial control of this estate as his only remaining path toward survival, worth any risk, any deception required to secure it." "Then perhaps," Alina suggested carefully, "the path forward is not simply confrontation and accusation, but understanding what truly drives him. A cornered man, especially one facing financial ruin, may prove more dangerous when exposed publicly than one offered some alternative path toward resolving his difficulties honestly." Alistair considered this thoughtfully, weighing her suggestion against the anger still simmering within him over the burned stable and the danger it represented. "You suggest mercy, then," he said slowly, "rather than immediate expulsion." "I suggest caution," she corrected gently. "Mercy, perhaps, if it proves warranted once the full truth is known. But caution first and always, given how much remains uncertain about exactly how far he is willing to go to secure what he believes he desperately needs." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, poring over the old documents by lamplight, piecing together fragments of a family history neither had fully understood before that night. Alistair found himself grateful, not for the first time, for Alina's steady, clear thinking in moments when his own judgment threatened to be clouded by anger and old grief alike. Whatever tomorrow's confrontation revealed, he felt more prepared to face it now, armed not only with suspicion, but with a deeper understanding of the true forces driving his uncle's desperate scheme. As the lamp finally burned low and exhaustion began overtaking them both, Alistair reached across the desk and took Alina's hand gently in his own, grateful beyond words for the quiet courage she brought to every challenge they now faced together. "Whatever we discover tomorrow," he said softly, "thank you for staying up with me tonight, searching for answers I might never have found alone." Alina squeezed his hand gently in return, her tired smile warm despite the late hour and the uncertainty still hanging over them both. "That is what partners do," she said simply. "We face the darkness together and search for whatever light we can find along the way." The confrontation Alistair had planned for the following morning never had the chance to unfold as intended, because Gerald Ravenswood was already gone from the house before the sun had fully risen, his room empty, his belongings vanished, leaving behind only an unmade bed and a single folded note left carefully upon the pillow. Edmund discovered the empty room first during his usual morning rounds and brought word to Alistair immediately, his expression tight with concern. Alistair read the note in silence, his jaw tightening with each line, before handing it wordlessly to Alina, who had joined him the moment word reached her of Gerald's sudden disappearance. The note was brief, its polished courtesy from previous days entirely abandoned in favor of something colder, more direct. Gerald wrote that he had grown tired of waiting for an answer he already knew would not favor him, and that Alistair would soon come to regret dismissing his generous offer of protection so carelessly. The final line, stark and unmistakable in its threat, promised that Alistair would learn precisely why the Ravenswood curse had persisted for 3 generations, and why it would not spare this particular chapter of the family's story either. "He has fled to prepare something," Alina said quietly, refolding the note with steady hands despite the fear evident in her eyes. "This is not surrender, Alistair. This is a man declaring open warfare, now that pretense has failed him." Alistair paced the length of his study, his mind racing through every possible danger Gerald might now attempt, freed from any remaining need to maintain appearances. "We must assume he intends something far more serious than another fire," he said grimly. "A man desperate enough to threaten openly after 15 years of careful silence will not simply retreat quietly into the countryside. He will strike again, and likely soon, before we have adequate time to prepare proper defenses." Edmund, summoned back into the study, was tasked immediately with strengthening security throughout the estate, doubling the number of staff keeping watch each night, ensuring every entrance remained locked and monitored, and sending word discreetly to the local magistrate regarding the suspected arson and the threatening note now in their possession. Peter, similarly, was instructed to keep careful watch over the grounds, particularly near the roads leading toward the estate, in case Gerald's threat involved returning with reinforcements of his own. Despite these careful preparations, 3 days passed with no further sign of Gerald or any renewed attack against the household, and the tension within Ravenswood Hall gradually, dangerously, began to ease. Alistair found himself daring to hope that perhaps the threat had been empty bravado from a defeated man retreating in humiliation, rather than a genuine promise of further violence to come. It was Alina who first noticed something wrong on the 4th morning, a strange bitterness in her tea that she initially dismissed as simply an unfamiliar blend before a sudden wave of dizziness overtook her, forcing her to grip the edge of the breakfast table for support. Alistair, seated across from her, noticed immediately, rising from his chair in alarm as her face paled dramatically and her hands began trembling uncontrollably. "Alina," he said urgently, moving quickly to her side, "what is happening? Speak to me." "I feel unwell," she managed, her voice already growing faint and unsteady. "Dizzy and my chest feels tight, as though I cannot draw a full breath." Alistair's blood ran cold with recognition, memories of Margaret's final moments flooding back with brutal, unwelcome clarity, the same sudden dizziness, the same tightness in the chest that had preceded her collapse at their engagement dinner years before. He caught Alina as her knees buckled beneath her, lowering her gently to the floor as he shouted desperately for Edmund, and for someone, anyone, to summon the village physician immediately. "Stay with me," he pleaded, cradling her against him as her eyes began fluttering closed despite her clear effort to remain conscious. "Alina, please, stay with me." The following hours blurred together in a haze of desperate activity. Servants rushing in every direction. Dr. Whitfield arriving from the village in record time, his weathered face grave as he examined Alina's rapidly weakening pulse and the unusual pallor spreading across her skin. Alastair remained at her bedside throughout, refusing every attempt by Edmund or the doctor to send him elsewhere while they worked, holding her hand tightly as though his grip alone might somehow anchor her against whatever was slowly, terrifyingly claiming her strength. "Poison," Dr. Whitfield finally announced grimly, after examining the remnants of the morning tea that Hilda had preserved on his urgent instruction. "Something introduced into her cup specifically, given that no one else in the household has shown similar symptoms this morning. I cannot yet identify the precise substance, but her symptoms suggest something slow-acting, designed perhaps to appear as natural illness rather than obvious attack, at least at first glance." "Will she survive?" Alastair asked, his voice barely steady enough to form the question, though he needed the answer regardless of how much he dreaded hearing it. "I cannot say with certainty," the doctor admitted honestly. "Much depends on exactly what substance was used and how quickly we can counteract its effects. I have administered what remedies I believe most likely to help, given her symptoms, but the coming hours will prove decisive one way or another." Alastair remained at her bedside through the long, agonizing hours that followed, watching helplessly as fever gripped her body, as her breathing grew shallow and labored, as the woman who had walked fearlessly into fire to save a stranger's life now fought silently against poison, delivered by that same stranger's own family. He thought, in his darkest moments during that endless vigil, of every warning he had ignored, every hope he had allowed himself despite 10 years of hard-learned caution, and wondered bitterly whether the old curse had simply been waiting, patient and inevitable, for him to lower his guard once more before claiming its next victim. Edmund found him there near dawn, still holding Alina's limp hand. His own eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and unshed grief he refused to release while any hope remained. "Your Grace," the butler said gently, "Peter has returned from the village with troubling news. A man matching your uncle's description was seen near the kitchen entrance 2 days before Miss Whitmore fell ill, speaking briefly with one of the newer kitchen maids before departing quickly when questioned by another servant nearby." Alastair's grip tightened involuntarily around Alina's fragile hand. "Which maid?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous in a way Edmund had rarely heard from his usually controlled employer. "A girl named Ruth, recently hired following the fire in the East Wing," Edmund replied carefully. "She has not reported for her duties this morning, Your Grace. Peter is searching for her now, though I fear she may already have fled the estate entirely." "Find her," Alastair said flatly, rising finally from his position at Alina's bedside, though every instinct screamed against leaving her even for a moment. If she was paid to introduce poison into that tea, she may hold information vital to understanding exactly what substance was used, information that could mean the difference between Alina's survival and her death. Edmund departed immediately to organize the search, leaving Alastair alone once more with Alina's fevered, unconscious form. He returned to her bedside, taking her hand once again, pressing it gently against his lips in a gesture of desperate tenderness he would never have permitted himself only weeks earlier. "You cannot leave me now," he whispered, his composure finally cracking under the weight of everything he had suppressed throughout the long night. "Not after showing me that love does not have to end in tragedy, that 10 years of fear were never truly protecting me at all, only keeping me from ever feeling alive again. Please, Alina, fight this. Fight for both of us, exactly as fiercely as you fought your way into that burning study to save a man you had only just met." The dawn light crept slowly through the bedroom windows as he spoke, illuminating Alina's pale, still face, offering no clear sign yet of whether his desperate plea had reached her at all. or whether the curse that had haunted his family for 3 generations was finally, cruelly, about to claim its most devastating victim yet. Hours passed in agonizing uncertainty. Dr. Whitfield returned periodically to check her condition, his expression revealing little beyond careful professional concern, offering no definitive reassurance either way. Hilda brought broth that went untouched, and fresh linens that Alistair barely noticed being changed around him. His entire world narrowed down to the shallow rise and fall of Alina's breathing, the faint, fluttering pulse beneath his fingertips whenever he pressed them gently against her wrist. It was well past midday when Peter finally returned, breathless and grim-faced, dragging behind him a terrified young woman whose tear-streaked face confirmed everything Alistair had already suspected. Ruth, barely more than a girl herself, confessed through broken sobs that a man matching Gerald's description had approached her with payment far exceeding her usual wages, asking only that she introduce a small vial of clear liquid into the young lady's morning tea, claiming it was merely a harmless sedative meant to encourage the guest to finally leave the estate peacefully. "I did not know it would truly harm her," Ruth wept, kneeling before Alistair in desperate apology. "I swear it, Your Grace, I would never have agreed had I known the truth of what he asked of me." "What was the substance?" Alistair demanded urgently, his patience for her guilt and tears exhausted entirely by the desperate need for information that might yet save Alina's life. "Did he give you any indication, any name, anything at all that might help the doctor treat her properly?" Ruth, trembling, reached into her apron pocket and produced a small, empty glass vial, extending it toward him with shaking hands. "He gave me this along with the payment," she said. "I do not know what it contained, only that he called it something strange, something like foxglove extract, though I confess I understood little of what that meant at the time." Alistair seized the vial and rushed it immediately to Dr. Whitfield, who examined the faint residue remaining inside with visible alarm the moment Ruth's description reached his ears. "Foxglove," he murmured grimly, "is a substance that can prove either medicinal or deadly, entirely dependent upon the dosage administered. In small, controlled amounts, it can regulate an unsteady heart. In excess, however, it proves lethal, causing exactly the symptoms Miss Whitmore now displays." "Can you treat it?" Alistair demanded, gripping the doctor's arm with an intensity that surprised them both. "There are remedies that may help counteract its effects if administered promptly," Dr. Whitfield replied, already moving quickly to prepare what was needed. "But I must act immediately, Your Grace. Every moment we delay reduces her chances further." Alistair stepped back, forcing himself to allow the doctor room to work, though every instinct within him screamed to remain close, to somehow will Alina back toward health through sheer determination alone. He watched from the doorway as Dr. Whitfield administered careful doses of what he explained was a counteracting remedy, monitoring Alina's pulse and breathing with intense concentration throughout the tense, silent minutes that followed. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, her breathing began to steady. The dangerous pallor gradually receded from her skin, replaced by the faint return of natural color. Her pulse, weak and fluttering only minutes before, grew steadier beneath the doctor's careful fingers, until finally, near sunset, Dr. Whitfield turned to Alistair with the first genuine relief he had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "She will recover," he said simply. "It will take some days for her full strength to return, but the immediate danger has passed. You may thank Peter's quick work in locating that young maid, Your Grace. Without knowing precisely what substance was used, I fear the outcome might have proven very different indeed." Alistair felt something within him break open at those words, relief so profound it left him momentarily unable to speak, unable to do anything except cross quickly to Alina's bedside and gently take her hand once more, feeling now the reassuring warmth returning gradually to her fingers, the steady pulse beneath her skin that promised she would, against everything the old curse seemed to demand, survive this attempt on her life. But even as relief washed over him, a colder, harder resolve began forming beneath it. Gerald Ravenswood had crossed a line from threat into attempted murder, And Alistair understood now, with absolute clarity, that this conflict would not end until his uncle was found, exposed, and stopped entirely, whatever that ultimately required. Alina did not fully wake until the following morning, her eyes opening slowly to find Alistair still seated beside her bed, his clothes rumpled from a night spent watching over her rather than resting himself. She blinked against the soft morning light, confusion clouding her features briefly before memory returned, along with a faint, weak smile that struck him as the most beautiful sight he had witnessed in his entire life. "You stayed," she murmured, her voice still rough and quiet from the ordeal her body had endured. "Of course I stayed," he replied, gently squeezing her hand, careful not to overwhelm her fragile strength with the full force of everything he had felt throughout that terrible night. "I was not about to leave your side, not after nearly losing you." Alina's expression sobered as fuller memory returned. "It was him," she said, not a question, "your uncle." Alistair nodded grimly. "A maid confessed to introducing foxglove extract into your tea, paid handsomely by a man matching his exact description. Dr. Whitfield believes you will make a full recovery, though it will take time for your strength to return completely." Alina closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this confirmation of what she had already suspected during her feverish, half-conscious hours. "Then he has shown his true intentions clearly now," she said finally, opening her eyes again to meet Alistair's steady gaze. "There can be no more doubt, no more careful consideration of mercy. He tried to kill me, Alistair, simply to remove an obstacle standing between himself and this estate." "I know," Alistair said quietly, his jaw tightening with barely controlled anger. "And I promise you, he will not have the chance to try again. I have already sent word to the magistrate regarding both the arson and now this attempted poisoning. Peter and several trusted men are searching the surrounding countryside for any sign of where he might have fled following his disappearance from the estate." Alina studied his face carefully, noting the exhaustion evident beneath his controlled anger. The toll this entire ordeal had clearly taken upon him even beyond his obvious relief at her survival. "You did not sleep at all, did you?" she said gently, changing the subject briefly, concerned now for his well-being as much as her own recovery. "I could not," he admitted, "not while uncertain whether you would wake at all." She reached up weakly, resting her palm gently against his cheek, the same gesture she had offered him weeks earlier in the garden, before either of them had fully understood how deeply they had come to care for one another. "You need rest as well," she said softly. "I am not going anywhere, Alistair. Whatever strength this poison tried to steal from me, I intend to reclaim every bit of it, and I cannot do that if I spend my recovery worrying over your own exhaustion instead." Reluctantly, Alistair allowed Hilda to convince him toward a few hours of rest later that morning, though sleep came only fitfully, his mind still churning with anger and fear despite Alina's reassurances. When he woke again near midday, it was to find Edmund waiting with fresh news, his expression grave. "Your Grace," the butler said carefully, "Peter's search has turned up something significant. A local farmer reports seeing a man matching your uncle's description at the crossroads in 2 villages over, 2 nights past. The innkeeper confirms a guest registered under a false name matching that same description, though he departed again before dawn the following morning, his destination unknown." Alistair rose immediately, his exhaustion forgotten in the face of this fresh lead. "Then we are not far behind him," he said grimly. "Gather Peter and whatever men can be spared from the estate's immediate protection. I intend to see this matter ended personally, before he has the opportunity to threaten anyone else I care for ever again." Edmund hesitated visibly. "Your Grace, might I suggest caution? A man desperate and dangerous enough to attempt poison may prove equally dangerous if cornered directly. Perhaps it would be wiser to leave this pursuit to the proper authorities, rather than risking your own safety in the process." Alistair paused at the study door, considering the butler's words carefully despite the anger still burning fiercely within him. "You are not wrong to caution me, Edmund," he admitted finally. "But I have spent 10 years hiding from danger, allowing fear to dictate every choice I made regarding my own life and happiness. I will not now hide while the man responsible for nearly killing the woman I love remains free to threaten her again. I will proceed carefully, and I will bring capable men with me for protection. But I will not simply wait passively while others handle what has become, very personally, my own fight to finish. With that resolve settled firmly in place, Alistair began preparing immediately for what he now understood would likely become the final, decisive confrontation with the uncle who had haunted his family's peace for far too many years already. A gunshot cracked through the misty morning air, and Alistair felt fire tear through his shoulder before he even registered the sound clearly enough to understand what had happened. He stumbled backward against a tree trunk, his hand instinctively pressing against the sudden warmth spreading rapidly beneath his coat, while Peter and the two other men accompanying him scattered instinctively for cover among the dense woodland surrounding the abandoned hunting lodge where their search had finally led them. "Stay down," Peter hissed urgently, crouching beside a fallen log a short distance away, his own pistol already drawn and ready. "Your Grace, are you hit badly?" Alistair gritted his teeth against the burning pain radiating outward from his shoulder, forcing his mind to remain clear despite the shock beginning to set in. "My shoulder," he managed. "Painful, but I do not believe it struck anything vital. Where did the shot come from?" "The lodge," one of the other men called out quietly from his own position behind a nearby boulder. "Upper window, second floor. He must have seen us approaching along the tree line." They had tracked Gerald's movements carefully over the previous 2 days, following a trail of increasingly desperate clues, an innkeeper's description here, a farmer's sighting there, until finally arriving at this remote hunting lodge deep within woodland that had belonged, generations earlier, to a distant branch of the Ravenswood family before falling into disuse and eventual abandonment. It seemed a fitting hiding place for a man attempting to disappear entirely from the world that had once cast him out so thoroughly. "Alistair, uncle," he called out loudly enough for his voice to carry toward the lodge, even as he pressed his good hand more firmly against his wounded shoulder to slow the bleeding. "This can end without further bloodshed. Surrender now, and I will ensure you receive fair treatment before the magistrate, rather than facing the full consequences your actions have truly earned." Silence answered him at first, broken only by the wind rustling through autumn leaves overhead and the distant, worried calls of birds disturbed by the earlier gunshot. Then, finally, Gerald's voice carried back toward them, strained and unmistakably desperate despite his attempt to sound controlled. "You do not understand what is truly at stake here, nephew," he called back. "This is not merely about ambition or inheritance, as you seem determined to believe. There are men in London, dangerous men, to whom I owe a debt so substantial that failure to repay it soon will cost me far more than mere reputation. It will cost my very life. I never wish to harm you or your companion directly, only to secure enough control over this estate's resources to finally settle what I owe before those men lose their patience entirely." "Alina told you of the debt she found recorded in the old family documents," Alistair called back, understanding now flooding through him alongside the pain still radiating from his shoulder. "Then let us help you settle it honestly, uncle, rather than through violence and deception that has already nearly cost an innocent woman her life. Surrender now, and I give you my word we will find some way to help resolve this debt properly, through legitimate means rather than theft or attempted murder." Another long silence stretched between them, tense enough that Alistair could hear his own heartbeat pounding loudly in his ears despite the throbbing pain in his shoulder. Finally, movement stirred within the lodge, and Gerald's figure appeared cautiously in the doorway, his pistol lowered though not yet fully discarded, his expression a complicated mixture of desperation, shame, and something that might, beneath it all, have been genuine relief at finally being caught rather than continuing to run. "I never wanted any of this," Gerald said quietly as he slowly descended the lodge's worn front steps. His cane, Alistair noticed distantly, entirely abandoned now that pretense no longer served any purpose. "I was a foolish young man who made terrible choices decades ago, and those choices have haunted every year since, growing heavier and more desperate with each passing season, until I found myself capable of things I never believed I would ever consider. Peter and the other men moved forward cautiously to secure Gerald's surrendered weapon, while Alistair remained braced against the tree, his vision beginning to swim slightly at the edges from blood loss and the shock finally catching up with his body's adrenaline-fueled resistance. "Your Grace," Peter called out with clear alarm, noticing his employer's increasingly unsteady stance, "we must get you back to the estate immediately. That wound needs proper attention before it worsens further." The journey back to Ravenswood Hall passed in a blurred haze for Alistair, pain and exhaustion combining to make the hours feel simultaneously endless and impossibly brief. He remembered fragments clearly, Gerald secured and silent in the wagon beside them, Peter's steady voice offering reassurance throughout the difficult ride. And finally, blessedly, the sight of the estate's familiar gray stone walls rising into view as evening light began to fade across the surrounding hills. Alina, still weak herself from her own recent ordeal, but insistent on rising from her sickbed, the moment word reached her of Alistair's injury, met the returning party in the courtyard, her face draining of color entirely at the sight of blood staining his coat and the pale, exhausted expression he wore. "What happened?" she demanded, rushing to his side despite Dr. Whitfield's urgent protests that she should return to her own bed, rather than exert herself further so soon after her poisoning. A bullet Alistair managed weakly, offering her a faint, reassuring smile despite the pain clearly etched across his features. "Nothing that proper rest and your company cannot help mend, I suspect." Alina's expression shifted rapidly from fear to fierce, protective determination as she helped guide him inside, refusing to leave his side even as Dr. Whitfield worked carefully to extract the bullet and properly clean and bandage the wound. Throughout the difficult procedure, she remained beside him, holding his uninjured hand tightly, offering quiet words of comfort whenever the pain grew particularly sharp, her own recent brush with death seemingly forgotten entirely in her determination to see him safely through his own ordeal now. "You are quite reckless, you know," she murmured once the worst of the procedure had finally concluded and Alistair lay resting against fresh pillows, his shoulder now properly bandaged, exhaustion finally overtaking the adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation and the long journey home afterward. "I learned recklessness from an excellent teacher," he replied weakly, managing a tired, genuine smile despite everything his body had endured that day. "Someone who once ran directly into a burning building to save a stranger she had only just met, if memory serves correctly." Alina laughed softly despite herself, though tears glistened briefly in her eyes as relief finally overtook the fear she had carried since first hearing of his injury. "That was different circumstances entirely," she protested weakly, though without any real conviction behind the argument. "Perhaps," Alistair conceded, his eyes growing heavy with exhaustion despite his clear reluctance to close them while she remained beside him. "But I find I cannot regret it, this recklessness we seem to share now. It brought me to you, after all, and whatever pain either of us endures along the way, I would not trade these past weeks for another decade of safe, empty solitude, not for anything in this world." Alina leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead, her lips lingering there for a long, tender moment before she finally settled into the chair beside his bed, still holding his hand firmly, as though unwilling to let go even for a moment now that they had both survived such dangerous, desperate hours. "Rest now," she said softly. "Your uncle is secured, the magistrate has been summoned, and this particular danger, at least, has finally come to its end. Whatever comes next, we will face it exactly as we have faced everything else together, and stronger for having survived this trial as well." Alistair drifted into exhausted sleep with her hand still clasped firmly in his own, and for the first time since childhood, he dreamed not of loss and grief, and the endless weight of a curse he had believed inescapable, but of gardens blooming wild and beautiful despite years of neglect, tended once more by careful, loving hands that refused to let anything precious simply wither away and disappear. Gerald Ravenswood was formally taken into the magistrate's custody the following morning, his confession, offered without further resistance, detailing not only the arson and the poisoning attempt, but the full extent of the crushing debt that had driven him toward such desperate, ultimately unforgivable choices. The magistrate, having reviewed the evidence Alastair and Alina had carefully gathered over the preceding weeks, along with Ruth's tearful corroborating testimony regarding the poison, assured Alastair that justice would proceed swiftly and appropriately given the severity of the crimes committed. As Gerald was led away in the magistrate's custody, he paused briefly near where Alastair stood watching from the front steps of Ravenswood Hall, his shoulder still heavily bandaged beneath his coat, Alina standing steadfastly beside him despite her own lingering weakness from the poisoning. "I am sorry, nephew," Gerald said quietly, genuine remorse finally breaking through the desperate calculation that had governed his actions for so many weeks. "Not for seeking a solution to my troubles, but for the harm I caused in pursuing it so recklessly. You have built something here I never managed to achieve myself, despite every advantage I once held. I hope, sincerely, that you and your lady find lasting happiness together, whatever becomes of me now." Alastair studied his uncle for a long, silent moment, old anger, and something unexpectedly close to pity mingling within him in equal measure. "I will ensure the magistrate knows the full circumstances of your debt," he said finally. "Whatever punishment you ultimately face, it need not be compounded further by allowing those London creditors to claim whatever remains of your dignity as well. That much, at least, I am willing to offer, for whatever remains of the family connection between us." Gerald's eyes glistened briefly with unexpected emotion before he was led firmly toward the waiting carriage, and Alastair watched until the vehicle disappeared entirely down the long drive and onto the road beyond, carrying with it the final, difficult chapter of a threat that had haunted his family's peace for far longer than the past several desperate weeks alone. As the carriage vanished from view, Alina slipped her hand gently into his uninjured one, and together they stood watching the empty road for a long, quiet moment, both finally allowing themselves to believe that this particular danger, at least, had truly, completely come to its end. In the days that followed, Ravenswood Hall settled into a rhythm neither of them had truly experienced within those walls before, a strange and welcome peace that felt almost foreign after so many weeks of fear and danger. Alastair's shoulder healed slowly under Dr. Whitfield's careful supervision, the wound leaving behind a scar he would carry for the rest of his life, though he found himself, oddly, grateful for the mark rather than resentful of it. It served, he decided, as a permanent reminder of everything he had nearly lost, and everything he had chosen to fight for instead of simply retreating back into fearful solitude. Alina's own strength returned gradually as well, color coming back fully into her cheeks, the tremor that had lingered briefly in her hands following the poisoning finally fading entirely after another week of careful rest, and Hilda's insistence on nourishing broths and gentle exercise around the estate grounds. Together, they began, almost without conscious decision, to rebuild what the recent chaos had damaged, overseeing repairs to the burned stable, arranging for new horses to be purchased once the rebuilding was complete, and slowly, tentatively, discussing what the future might hold now that the immediate danger had passed. One afternoon, several weeks after Gerald's departure, Alastair found himself once again in the overgrown rose garden behind the house, though this time he was not alone with his thoughts, but working alongside Alina, both of them kneeling in the soft earth, carefully clearing away years of neglected weeds and tangled, thorny growth to reveal the original rose beds his mother had once tended so lovingly. "I still cannot quite believe how much has changed," he admitted, pausing to wipe dirt from his hands, watching Alina carefully untangle a particularly stubborn vine from around one of the older rose bushes. "Only months ago, I could not imagine allowing any woman past my front gates, let alone imagining a future built alongside one." Alina glanced up at him, a smudge of dirt across her cheek, her expression warm with the same quiet affection that had grown steadily between them throughout everything they had endured together. "And now," she asked gently, "what do you imagine, Alastair Ravenswood, now that the curse you feared for so long has proven nothing more than a desperate man's cruel scheme?" He considered the question seriously, setting aside his gardening tools entirely to give her his full attention. "I imagine a life I never believed myself capable of having," he said honestly. "Children playing in gardens that are cared for rather than left to grow wild with grief. A wife who does not fear my family's history, because she helped me prove that history was never truly a curse at all, only fear given too much power over too many years. I imagine, Alina, a future spent beside you if you are willing to have me, scars and complicated family history included." Alina's breath caught softly at the clear direction his words were heading, though she said nothing yet, simply watching him with wide, hopeful eyes as he reached carefully into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box he had clearly been carrying for some days, waiting for the right moment to finally offer it. "I know it has been a shorter courtship than most families would consider proper," he continued, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant ring that had belonged, he explained quietly, to his own mother before her death. "But I have spent 10 years running from every possibility of love, certain it could only bring tragedy in its wake. You changed that, Alina, not through grand gestures but simply by refusing to be frightened away, by holding my hand through fire and danger alike and proving, again and again, that some things are worth every risk they carry. Will you marry me and help me build the life I never believed I deserved to have?" Alina's answer came not immediately in words, but in the tears that gathered in her eyes and the soft, joyful laugh that escaped her as she reached out and took his face gently in both her dirt-smudged hands, pulling him close enough to press her forehead against his in the same tender gesture they had shared during their darkest, most frightening moments together. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Alistair, 1,000 times yes. I fell in love with you somewhere between that burning study and this overgrown garden, and I have no intention of letting you face the rest of your life alone, curse or no curse, ever again." He slipped the ring gently onto her finger, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear this time, but from overwhelming joy he had never truly believed himself capable of experiencing so fully. Around them, the garden they had spent the afternoon carefully restoring seemed to catch the golden afternoon light beautifully, wild roses beginning to show the first hints of new growth among branches that had gone untended for far too many years, much like the man who now knelt among them, finally allowing himself to bloom again after a decade spent believing himself forever bound to solitude and grief. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the household, and eventually through the entire village of Ashford Vale, met with genuine celebration from staff who had watched their master transform gradually from a cold, distant figure into someone capable, once again, of warmth, laughter, and hope. Yet even as joy settled over Ravenswood Hall in those following weeks, neither Alistair nor Alina could fully shake a lingering unease, a quiet awareness that Gerald's confession, however thorough it had seemed, might not have told the entire truth of everything that had transpired, nor accounted fully for every danger that still might yet remain hidden, waiting patiently in the shadows of a family history far more complicated than either of them had yet fully uncovered. A carriage arrived unannounced at Ravenswood Hall exactly 1 week before the wedding, carrying a woman neither Alistair nor Alina had ever met, though her resemblance to the old family portraits hanging throughout the estate was unmistakable enough to send a fresh wave of unease rippling through the household the moment she stepped down from the vehicle. "I apologize for arriving without prior notice," the woman said, her voice carrying an accent that suggested many years spent abroad, her posture proud despite clear exhaustion from travel. "My name is Charlotte Ravenswood. I believe you may know of my father, though perhaps not favorably, given recent events. I am Gerald Ravenswood's daughter." Alistair stood frozen in the entrance hall, processing this unexpected revelation with visible shock. He had known, distantly, that his uncle possessed a daughter from a marriage abroad, though the connection had never seemed relevant throughout the recent crisis, Gerald himself never once mentioning her presence or involvement in any capacity. "I received word of my father's arrest only recently," Charlotte continued, her composure remarkable given the circumstances, though grief and worry remained visible beneath her careful control. "I have come because there is something you urgently need to know, something my father was too ashamed, or perhaps too afraid, to fully confess even after his capture." Alina, standing beside Alistair, exchanged a wary glance with him before gesturing toward the drawing room. "Please," she said carefully, "come inside. Whatever you have to tell us, we would rather hear it fully and clearly than left wondering." Once settled with tea neither woman touched, Charlotte began her account slowly, choosing her words with obvious difficulty. "My father did not act entirely alone in his scheme against this family," she said finally. "The debt he owed in London was real, desperately real, but the plan to exploit the family curse, to specifically target whichever woman might finally break through your isolation, Alistair, that plan originated with someone else entirely. Someone my father owed even greater loyalty to than the men demanding repayment of his debt." "Who?" Alistair demanded, his earlier shock rapidly transforming into renewed alarm. Charlotte hesitated visibly before continuing. "There is another relative you may not know of," she said carefully. "My father's half-brother, born from an affair your own grandfather conducted decades ago, a connection your family successfully kept hidden from public knowledge for generations. Though not, apparently, hidden well enough to prevent that hidden son from eventually learning the truth of his own parentage, and nursing a bitter resentment toward the legitimate branch of the family ever since." Alina's breath caught sharply. "Are you suggesting this hidden relative orchestrated everything?" she asked slowly, working through the implications. "That your father was merely a tool, used because his existing debt and desperation made him vulnerable to manipulation?" "Precisely," Charlotte confirmed grimly. "My father confessed everything to me shortly before his arrest became public knowledge, in a letter he managed to have delivered before authorities fully secured his correspondence. This half-brother, who goes by the name Victor Hale, having taken his mother's family name rather than claim any connection to the Ravenswood line publicly, approached my father nearly a year ago, offering to settle his London debts entirely in exchange for help executing a plan that would ultimately destabilize Ravenswood Hall enough to allow Victor himself to eventually claim control. Using claims regarding illegitimate birthright that he has apparently been quietly gathering evidence to support for years." Alistair rose abruptly from his chair, pacing the length of the drawing room as this new revelation settled over him with dawning, horrified clarity. "Then Gerald's confession to the magistrate," he said slowly, "was incomplete. He protected this Victor Hale even after his own capture, even after everything that had already been risked and lost." "My father is a flawed man," Charlotte said quietly, tears finally gathering in her composed eyes. "But he is not without honor entirely, twisted though his sense of it may have become through years of desperation. Victor promised to ensure my safety and my mother's comfortable circumstances abroad should my father ever be caught, provided he revealed nothing of Victor's true involvement. I believe my father kept that silence not for his own sake, but for ours, believing it the only protection he could still offer his family after everything else had already fallen apart around him." Alina's mind raced through the implications, her earlier calm giving way to genuine alarm as she considered what this meant for their continued safety. "If this Victor Hale orchestrated everything from the shadows," she said carefully, "then the true danger to this family was never truly resolved at all. He remains free, presumably still determined to claim this estate by whatever means necessary, and now aware that his previous scheme through your father has failed entirely." Charlotte nodded grimly. "That is precisely why I came the moment I learned the truth myself," she said. "I could not in good conscience allow you both to celebrate a wedding, believing yourselves finally safe, while a far more dangerous and patient enemy remains free to strike again whenever opportunity presents itself." Alistair stopped his pacing abruptly, turning to face both women with grim, determined resolve settling across his features. "Do you know where this Victor Hale might currently be found?" he asked. "I do not know his exact location," Charlotte admitted, "but my father's letter mentioned that Victor has spent recent years building connections among London's business circles, presenting himself as a legitimate merchant, while quietly accumulating resources and influence he intended eventually to use in pursuing his claim against this estate. He is patient, methodical, and far more dangerous than my father ever proved himself capable of being, precisely because he has spent years planning carefully rather than acting from desperate, immediate need. Alina reached for Alistair's hand, drawing strength from the contact even as fear settled cold and heavy in her stomach at this unwelcome new revelation. "Then we cannot simply wait for him to make the next move," she said firmly. "We must be proactive, gathering whatever evidence exists of his claimed parentage and his true intentions, before he has the opportunity to strike in a manner even more devastating than everything we have already survived together." Charlotte, watching the determined resolve settling between them, felt something like relief mixing with her guilt over her father's actions. "I have brought with me what documentation I could gather before leaving," she said, producing a small leather satchel from beneath her travel cloak. "Letters my father kept hidden, records of payments made to Victor over recent years. Enough evidence, I believe, to at least begin building a clearer picture of exactly who this man truly is and what resources he commands." Over the following hours, the three of them pored carefully through Charlotte's documentation, piecing together a portrait of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades nursing quiet resentment, while carefully building the connections and resources necessary to eventually challenge the legitimate Ravenswood line for control of the family estate. Letters revealed a pattern of careful, patient manipulation, small investments made in local businesses throughout Ashford Vale over recent years, quiet relationships cultivated with several members of the county's gentry, all seemingly designed to build a foundation of local support and legitimacy that could eventually be leveraged should Victor ever choose to press his claim openly. "He has been preparing for this far longer than we realized," Alistair said grimly, setting down a particularly damning letter detailing payments made to a London solicitor known for handling complicated inheritance disputes. "This was never simply about Gerald's desperate debt. This was always the true scheme, with my uncle merely serving as the first, expendable instrument in a much larger plan." Alina studied the documents spread across the table with careful, methodical attention, her earlier fear gradually transforming into the same determined focus that had carried her through every previous crisis they had faced together. "Then we must move quickly," she said firmly. "Before Victor learns that his connection to these events has been exposed, we should consult directly with the magistrate regarding this new evidence, and perhaps engage legal counsel of our own to ensure your claim to this estate remains absolutely unassailable against whatever challenge he might eventually attempt to bring forward." Charlotte, watching the two of them work together with such natural, practiced partnership despite the fresh danger now confronting them, felt a quiet, unexpected admiration growing alongside her lingering guilt. "You have found something remarkable together," she observed softly, breaking the tense concentration that had settled over the room. "Whatever danger still remains ahead, I do not believe Victor Hale has any true understanding of what he is truly facing in confronting you both." Alistair looked up from the documents, meeting Alina's steady, determined gaze across the table, drawing quiet strength from the partnership they had built together through fire and poison, and every desperate trial that had come before this newest revelation. "Perhaps not," he agreed quietly. "But he will learn soon enough, exactly as my uncle eventually did, that this family and this love we have built despite every obstacle placed before it is far stronger than any curse, real or manufactured, that anyone might attempt to use against us." As evening settled over Ravenswood Hall that night, the wedding preparations continuing quietly in the background despite this fresh complication now shadowing their future, Alistair found himself once again standing at his study window, watching darkness gather over the hills beyond his estate. Alina joined him there quietly, slipping her hand into his exactly as she had done so many times before during their most difficult moments together. "We will face this too," she said softly, echoing words she had offered him so many times throughout their journey together. "Whatever Victor Hale believes he can accomplish, he has clearly underestimated exactly how much strength two people can find in each other, when they refused to let fear dictate their choices any longer. Alastair drew her closer, resting his cheek gently against the top of her head, drawing comfort from her steady presence even as new uncertainty gathered on the horizon before them. "I do not fear him," he said quietly, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the words carried genuine truth rather than simply brave pretense. "Not the way I once feared everything connected to this family's cursed history. Whatever he attempts, we face it as partners now, exactly as we have promised each other from the very beginning of everything that has brought us to this moment together." The following morning, Alastair sent an urgent letter to the county magistrate requesting a private meeting to discuss the new evidence, while Edmund was tasked with quietly reinforcing security throughout the estate once again, this time with instructions to watch particularly for any unfamiliar visitors claiming business or social connections rather than open threats. Given what they now understood about Victor's preferred methods of careful, patient infiltration rather than direct confrontation. Charlotte remained at Ravenswood Hall in the days that followed, her knowledge of Victor's habits and connections proving invaluable as Alastair and Alina worked to prepare their defenses against whatever challenge might eventually come. She spoke carefully of childhood memories, fragments overheard from her father's private conversations over the years, small details that individually seemed insignificant but together began forming a clearer picture of a man who valued patience and reputation above all else. Someone who would likely prefer to press his claim through careful legal maneuvering and cultivated public sympathy, rather than the crude violence his half-brother had ultimately resorted to. He will not risk his carefully built reputation through anything so obvious as poison or fire, Charlotte explained one evening as they reviewed the gathered documents once more. That was always Gerald's desperate, clumsy contribution to the scheme, not Victor's true preference. "If he moves against you now, I believe it will come through legal challenge, through questioning the legitimacy of your own claim to this estate, perhaps even through carefully cultivated rumors designed to turn local opinion, and eventually the courts against you." Alina considered this thoughtfully, turning the possibility over in her mind with the same careful analysis she brought to every challenge. "Then perhaps our best defense," she suggested slowly, "is not merely gathering evidence against him, but ensuring our own position remains completely unassailable. A properly documented marriage, witnessed publicly and celebrated openly throughout the county, would make it far more difficult for anyone to later claim impropriety or vulnerability in your household's legitimacy." Alastair considered her suggestion carefully, recognizing the practical wisdom behind it even amid the danger still surrounding them. "You suggest we proceed with the wedding as planned, then," he said, "rather than delaying out of caution regarding this new threat." "I suggest we proceed with the wedding precisely because of this new threat," Alina corrected gently. "Victor Hale has spent years building his scheme in shadows and secrecy. Let us meet that patience with something he clearly did not anticipate: open, public commitment that leaves no room for the kind of quiet doubt and manipulation he has apparently spent so long carefully cultivating." Charlotte, listening to this exchange, felt renewed admiration for the steady partnership these two had built together, so different from the desperate scheming that had consumed her own father for so many wasted years. "Perhaps," she offered quietly, "I might remain to help however I can, not only in gathering further evidence against Victor, but in beginning to make what small amends I am able for the harm my father's actions caused this family, however unwillingly he may have ultimately participated in Victor's larger design." Alastair studied her for a long moment, weighing her sincerity against the caution that recent events had taught him to maintain even towards seemingly well-intentioned relatives. "You are welcome to remain, Charlotte," he said finally, "and your honesty in coming forward, despite the difficult position it placed you in regarding your own father, speaks well of your character. Perhaps this family has room yet for reconciliation, even after everything that has transpired, provided it is built on the same honesty you have shown us today, rather than the secrecy and desperation that nearly destroyed us all." With that fragile but genuine trust established between them, The household turned its attention back toward wedding preparations, even as careful watch continued throughout the estate for any sign that Victor Hale's patient scheme might finally be moving toward its own inevitable confrontation. A stranger walked calmly into the village church during the wedding rehearsal, his fine London tailored clothing immediately marking him as an outsider among the modest gathering of estate staff and local villagers, helping prepare the small chapel for the following day's ceremony. Peter noticed him first, positioned near the rear entrance as instructed, and moved quickly to intercept him before he could approach any closer to where Alistair and Alina stood near the altar, reviewing final details with the local vicar. Alistair, alerted immediately by Peter's tense signal, excused himself and crossed the chapel with measured, controlled steps, though his heart pounded with sudden, sharp awareness of what this unexpected visit likely meant. The stranger, tall and composed, with dark hair and features that carried unmistakable traces of family resemblance despite years, spent building an entirely separate identity, offered a polite, unhurried bow as Alistair approached. "Victor Hale, I presume," Alistair said, his voice carefully leveled despite the tension coiling tightly through his entire body. The stranger's expression flickered with brief surprise before settling into something closer to grim acknowledgement. "It seems my father's confession, or perhaps my half-brother's daughter's loyalty to this family, has revealed more than I anticipated," he said smoothly. "No matter. I had intended to introduce myself eventually regardless, though perhaps not in quite such dramatic circumstances as your wedding rehearsal." Alina joined Alistair's side quickly, her expression carefully neutral despite the obvious tension radiating through the small gathering now watching the exchange with visible unease. "What is it you want here, Mr. Hale?" she asked directly, refusing to allow the newcomer's practiced composure to dictate the tone of their confrontation. Victor's gaze shifted to her with cool, assessing interest. "Straightforward," he observed. "I appreciate that, given how much unnecessary complication has already surrounded this family's recent history. I have come, quite simply, to offer a proposal before matters progress any further toward legal entanglement, one final opportunity for reasonable settlement between us, rather than the costly, public battle that will otherwise inevitably follow." Alistair felt anger rising sharply within him at the man's calm, calculated tone, so different from Gerald's desperate scrambling, yet no less dangerous for its cold composure. "You orchestrated fire and poison against this household," he said, his voice low and controlled despite the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "You call that reasonable?" Victor's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I orchestrated nothing directly," he replied carefully. "My half-brother's methods were his own choice, born of his own desperation, though I confess I did not discourage him strongly enough when opportunity presented itself to weaken your position. That failing, I acknowledge, weighs upon my conscience more than you might expect. But my true claim against this estate rests on legitimate grounds entirely separate from Gerald's clumsy scheming, grounds I intend to pursue through proper legal channels, whatever choice you make regarding my proposal today." "Speak plainly, then," Alistair demanded. "What proposal do you believe I would possibly consider, given everything your family's schemes have already cost the people I love?" Victor's gaze flickered briefly toward Alina before returning to Alistair with careful, deliberate focus. "A settlement," he said simply. "A portion of the estate's income, paid quietly and privately, in exchange for my agreement never to press my claim publicly regarding our shared grandfather's illegitimate line. It would spare us both the costly, public scrutiny that a formal legal challenge would inevitably invite, scrutiny that I suspect neither of us truly wishes to endure, given how thoroughly your family's reputation has already suffered through recent events." Alistair studied the man carefully, recognizing the calculated logic behind the proposal, even as every instinct rebelled against yielding anything at all to a man who had orchestrated such suffering against people he loved. "And if I refuse?" he asked evenly. "Then I will pursue my claim through the courts," Victor replied without hesitation, his composure never wavering. I have spent years gathering evidence and cultivating relationships that will serve that pursuit well. Evidence I am confident will prove at minimum sufficient to cast significant, damaging doubt upon your own uncontested claim to this estate, whatever the court's final judgment ultimately decides. Alina, who had remained quietly observant throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying unmistakable steel beneath its surface. "You speak of costly public scrutiny as though it frightens us," she said. "But Mr. Hale, we have already survived fire, poison, and gunfire in defense of this family and this estate. A courtroom holds far less terror for us than it perhaps should for you, given how thoroughly your own methods, however indirect you claim your involvement to have been, would surely come under equal scrutiny once fully examined." Victor's composed expression flickered again, genuine uncertainty briefly visible beneath his careful control for the first time since entering the chapel. "You would truly risk public scandal?" he asked, "rather than accept a private, discreet settlement that would allow us both to move forward without further complication?" "We would risk anything," Alastair said firmly, "rather than allow a man who nearly caused the death of the woman I love to profit quietly from that suffering, regardless of how carefully he attempts to distance himself from his own half-brother's desperate crimes. Pursue your claim through the courts if you must, Victor. I will meet you there, with every piece of evidence Charlotte has already provided, and every resource this estate still commands, however diminished your recent schemes have attempted to make it." A tense silence stretched between them, broken finally by the soft, unexpected sound of the chapel doors opening once more, admitting the local magistrate himself, summoned quietly by Peter the moment Victor's identity had been confirmed, along with 2 constables accompanying him. "Mr. Hale," the magistrate said calmly, stepping forward with the quiet authority of a man well accustomed to handling difficult confrontations, "I believe we have some matters to discuss, given evidence recently brought to my attention regarding your involvement in the arson and poisoning that occurred at Ravenswood Hall in recent weeks. I would ask that you accompany my constables to answer some questions, given the seriousness of these allegations." Victor's composure finally cracked visibly, genuine alarm flashing across his features for the first time since his arrival. "I have committed no crime that can be proven," he protested, though his voice carried less certainty than his earlier calculated calm had suggested. "Whatever Gerald claims regarding my involvement, it remains merely his word against mine, insufficient grounds for any formal charge." "Perhaps," the magistrate replied evenly, "or perhaps the documentation Miss Charlotte Ravenswood has provided, detailing years of payments and correspondence between yourself and your half-brother, will prove otherwise once properly examined by the court. Either way, Mr. Hale, these are matters best discussed through proper legal process, rather than confronted directly at a private family wedding rehearsal." As the constables moved to escort Victor from the chapel, his composure entirely abandoned now in favor of visible, mounting panic. He turned back briefly toward Alastair and Alina, his expression carrying something that might, beneath the fear, have been genuine, bitter regret. "This was never truly about you, personally," he said quietly, his earlier calculated tone entirely gone now. "It was about a lifetime spent watching a legitimate family enjoy privileges I was denied through no fault of my own, only an accident of birth outside proper marriage. I do not expect forgiveness for how I chose to pursue that grievance. But I hope sincerely that you understand it was never simple greed alone that drove me toward such desperate, ultimately foolish choices." Alastair watched him being led away, old anger slowly softening into something more complicated, a recognition, perhaps, that pain and grievance, however wrongly acted upon, still deserved acknowledgement even amid necessary consequence. "I understand more than you might expect," he said finally, his voice carrying quiet, unexpected compassion despite everything Victor's schemes had cost. "This family's history is filled with secrets and hidden pain that damaged far more people than either of us fully realized until recently. Perhaps, once proper justice has run its course, there remains room yet for some measure of reconciliation. though it will require honesty and patience far different from the secrecy that has governed this family for far too many generations already. As Victor was finally led from the chapel, and the tension gradually eased from the gathered witnesses, Alina slipped her hand into Alistair's, offering silent comfort and quiet celebration in equal measure at this final, decisive resolution to the danger that had shadowed their entire courtship from its very beginning. "It is truly over now," she said softly, watching the chapel doors close behind the departing constables. Alistair turned to face her fully, drawing her gently into his arms despite the small audience of curious villagers and estate staff still gathered throughout the chapel. "It is," he confirmed, his voice thick with relief and profound gratitude. 10 years of fear, 3 generations of tragedy mistaken for curse, and countless desperate schemes born from old family wounds left too long unhealed. All of it ends here, in this chapel, on the very eve of the wedding that finally proves love stronger than any fear or manipulation that tried so hard to prevent it. The following day dawned bright and clear, autumn sunlight streaming gently through the chapel's ancient, stained glass windows as Alistair Ravenswood stood before the altar, watching Alina Whitmore walk slowly toward him down the modest aisle, her dress simple but beautiful, her expression radiant with a joy that had seemed impossible only months earlier, when she had first arrived soaked and shivering at his gates during a storm that had changed both their lives forever. The ceremony proceeded with quiet, genuine warmth, witnessed by household staff who had watched their master transform from a cold, isolated figure into someone capable once again of love and hope, by villagers curious to witness the end of a story that had captivated local gossip for months, and by Charlotte, standing quietly near the back. Her own complicated grief over her father's continuing legal troubles softened somewhat by genuine happiness for the cousin she had only recently come to know. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, and Alistair took Alina's hand in his before the entire gathered assembly, no fear trembled through his fingers as it once might have, only steady, certain joy at finally holding the hand of a woman who had proven, through fire and poison, and every desperate trial along the way, that love given freely and received with equal courage could indeed break even the darkest, most persistent shadow a family's troubled history might cast. As they walked together back down the aisle toward the bright autumn sunlight waiting beyond the chapel doors, hand in hand before the entire village, Alistair Ravenswood understood with complete, unshakable certainty that whatever challenges still remained ahead, whatever final legal proceedings against Victor Hale might yet unfold, he would face them all exactly as he had faced everything since that first storm-swept night when Alina's hand had first closed firmly around his own. Not as a man cursed by fate, but as a man finally, truly free to build the life and love he had once believed entirely beyond his reach. The celebration that followed spilled out across the grounds of Ravenswood Hall itself, tables set beneath the very rose garden Alistair and Alina had spent so many careful hours restoring together, the flowers now blooming fully for the first time in years, their fragrance mixing sweetly with the crisp autumn air, as villagers and household staff alike gathered to celebrate a union that had, in its own quiet way, healed far more than simply two hearts finding each other amid danger and uncertainty. Hilda outdid herself with the wedding feast, insisting despite her advancing years on personally overseeing every dish prepared for the occasion, while Edmund, normally so composed and formal, allowed himself the rare indulgence of a genuine, unguarded smile as he watched the master he had served faithfully through a decade of grief finally find happiness so richly deserved. Peter, still bearing faint scars from the confrontation at the hunting lodge weeks earlier, raised his glass in a heartfelt toast that left more than a few guests wiping away tears of genuine joy. Charlotte approached Alina quietly during a lull in the celebration, her expression thoughtful as she watched the joyful gathering around them. "I confess," she said softly, "I did not expect to feel such genuine happiness witnessing this, given everything my own father's choices brought upon this family. Yet watching you both today, I find myself believing perhaps this family's long history of pain might finally be turning toward something brighter." Alina smiled warmly, reaching out to clasp Charlotte's hand gently in her own, "Your honesty saved us from far greater danger than we yet realized," she said sincerely. "Whatever burden you carry regarding your father's choices, know that you are welcome here, Charlotte, not as a reminder of past pain, but as family who chose courage and truth when it would have been far easier to remain silent." As the afternoon stretched into golden evening, Alistair found a quiet moment to draw Alina away from the celebration, leading her back toward the rose garden where their engagement had first been sealed weeks earlier. The last rays of sunset painted the sky in brilliant shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the newly restored garden beds. "Do you remember," he asked softly, drawing her close beneath the same rose bush where he had first proposed, "what you said to me that very first night, when you pulled me from the burning study?" Alina laughed softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they watched the sunset together. "I believe I called you reckless for risking your life over a ledger," she recalled fondly. "And you called leaving me to burn sensible," he reminded her with a warm, teasing smile. "I have thought of that exchange often since, of how strange it was that a woman I had known less than a single day would risk her own safety so readily for a stranger burdened by a curse she knew nothing about. I did not need to know the details of your family's history to recognize a man worth saving," Alina replied gently, reaching up to trace her fingers softly along his jaw. "I saw it in your eyes even then, Alistair, buried beneath all that careful distance and fear. Something worth fighting for, worth risking everything to reach." He turned to face her fully, capturing her hand in his and pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, exactly where the wedding ring now rested alongside her original engagement band. "10 years I spent believing myself cursed beyond redemption," he said quietly, "believing that love itself was a danger too great to risk, that every woman who came near me was destined for tragedy simply by association with my family's name. You proved that fear wrong not through grand declarations, but through simple, stubborn courage, refusing again and again to be frightened away by shadows that, in the end, proved to be nothing more than desperate men exploiting old grief for their own gain." Alina smiled softly, leaning into his embrace as the last light of sunset faded gently into the soft blue of early evening. "Then perhaps," she said, "the true lesson in all of this was never truly about curses or fate at all, but about the choice we each make, every single day, to reach for connection despite fear, to hold on despite every reason we might find to let go. You chose that, Alistair, the moment you allowed Edmund to bring a stranded stranger through your gates on a stormy night, even against every instinct screaming otherwise. And I would make that same choice again, without hesitation," he murmured, drawing her closer still, "1,000 times over, in 1,000 different storms, if it meant finding my way back to you every single time." As darkness finally settled fully over Ravenswood Hall, the celebration continuing warmly in the distance behind them, Alistair Ravenswood stood in the garden his mother had once tended so lovingly, now restored and blooming once more, holding the hand of the woman who had changed his fate not through magic or fortune, but through simple, unwavering courage and love freely given. The curse that had haunted 3 generations of his family had finally, truly been broken not by chance, but by choice, sealed forever in the quiet, steady grip of 2 hands that had learned, through fire and danger and everything in between, that love was never the tragedy his family had feared it to be. It had always, from the very beginning, been the answer. A messenger arrived at Ravenswood Hall nearly 6 months after the wedding, breathless from a hard ride, carrying news from the London courts that both Alistair and Alina had awaited with cautious hope through the long winter months. Victor Hale's claim against the estate had been formally dismissed, the evidence Charlotte provided proving more than sufficient to establish both his direct involvement in the arson and poisoning, and the fundamental weakness of his legal claim to any portion of the Ravenswood inheritance. He had been sentenced to several years of imprisonment, his carefully built reputation among London's business circles collapsing entirely once the full truth of his schemes became public record. Gerald Ravenswood, meanwhile, had received a lighter sentence than he might otherwise have faced, owing largely to Alistair's willingness to speak on his behalf before the court. detailing the crushing debt and desperate manipulation that had driven his uncle toward such regrettable choices. Charlotte, who had remained at Ravenswood Hall throughout the winter, wept with quiet relief upon receiving word that her father would serve his sentence at a facility not far from London, allowing her the opportunity to visit him regularly once matters settled. Perhaps, she said to Alina one evening as spring finally began warming the estate grounds, there remains a chance yet for him to rebuild something meaningful from what remains of his life. Once his debt to society, as much as his debt to those London creditors, has finally been paid in full. Alina, now visibly expecting their first child, squeezed Charlotte's hand warmly. Redemption is rarely simple or swift, she said gently, but it is rarely impossible either, provided the desire for it remains genuine. Your father has you, Charlotte, and that alone speaks to something worth preserving in him, whatever mistakes darkened his earlier years. The household settled into a rhythm of quiet contentment throughout that spring, the rose garden blooming more fully than it had in decades, the rebuilt stable once again filled with the sounds of horses, and the cheerful whistling of Peter as he went about his daily work. Edmund, though he would never fully abandon his formal reserve, had grown noticeably warmer in his interactions with the household since the wedding, taking evident pride in overseeing an estate that finally felt, in his own quiet words to Hilda one evening, like a proper home again rather than merely a grand house shadowed by grief. Alastair himself had changed perhaps more than anyone else within those walls. The careful, guarded distance that had once governed every interaction with his household staff, softening gradually into genuine warmth and easy laughter that surprised even those who had known him longest. He took to walking the estate grounds each morning with Alina, discussing plans for the nursery being prepared in the west wing, for improvements to the tenant cottages scattered across the estate's farmland, for a future that stretched ahead of them now bright and full of possibility rather than shadowed by fear. One particularly warm afternoon in early summer, as Alina rested in the garden beneath the shade of an old oak tree, her hand resting gently against the gentle curve of her growing pregnancy, Alastair joined her, settling comfortably beside her on the soft grass, watching bees drift lazily between the fully blooming roses they had restored together so many months earlier. "Do you ever think of that first night?" he asked quietly, "of the storm that brought you to my door?" Alina smiled, tilting her face up toward the warm sunlight filtering through the oak leaves above them. "Often," she admitted. "I think of how frightened I was, stranded on that flooded road, and how I never could have imagined that shelter would lead me toward everything I now have. A husband I love deeply, a family growing within me, and a home finally filled with warmth rather than the cold silence you once described to me during those early weeks." "I think of it too," he said softly, reaching over to rest his hand gently against hers atop the curve of her stomach, feeling the faint, precious movement of their child beneath his palm. "I think of how close I came to sending you back out into that storm, following 10 years of careful, fearful discipline rather than the instinct that finally told me to let you stay. I am endlessly grateful, Alina, that some small part of me remained capable of choosing differently that night, even before I fully understood why." Alina turned to meet his gaze, her expression soft with the same quiet, steady love that had carried them both through every trial they had faced together since that stormy first meeting. "Perhaps that is the truest lesson this entire journey has taught us both," she said gently. "That fate is never simply something that happens to us, fixed and unchangeable. It is something we choose, again and again, in every small decision to open a door rather than keep it locked, to reach for a hand rather than pull away from it, to believe in love even when every past experience has taught us to fear it instead." Alastair leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, his heart full with a peace and happiness he had once believed entirely beyond his reach. "Then I choose you," he murmured softly, "exactly as I have chosen you every single day since that first storm brought you to my gates. And I will continue choosing you, Alina, every day for the rest of our lives together, curse or no curse, storm or clear skies, whatever challenges the future may yet bring our way." As summer deepened across the English countryside, the Ravenswood estate flourished under careful, loving stewardship, its once overgrown gardens now blooming beautifully each season, its halls filled with warmth and laughter rather than the cold silence that had haunted them for so many years. When their daughter was finally born that autumn, exactly 1 year after the storm that had first brought Alina stumbling through the estate gates, Alastair held his newborn child in trembling, joyful arms, understanding at last that the curse his family had feared for 3 generations had never truly been supernatural fate at all, but simply grief and fear, given far more power than they ever deserved to hold. They named her Margaret, in honor of the fiancé whose tragic death had once convinced Alastair that love itself was too dangerous a risk to ever take again. A quiet tribute ensuring that even old sorrow might find its place within a story now defined far more by hope than by loss. Alina held their daughter close that first night, watching Alastair's face soften with a tenderness that would have seemed impossible to the isolated, guarded man he had once been, and felt profound gratitude for every difficult trial that had led them both, ultimately, toward this precious, hard-won happiness. The Ravenswood family's long-shadowed history did not vanish entirely, of course, nor did every difficult memory fade completely with time. Scars remained, both visible and otherwise, reminders of fires survived and poison overcome and threats faced with courage neither Alastair nor Alina had fully known themselves capable of until circumstance demanded it of them both. But those scars, they came to understand together over the years that followed, were not marks of a curse that had finally caught up with them, but proof instead of everything they had fought through and survived, side by side, hand in hand, exactly as they had promised each other from the very beginning. Years later, when their daughter Margaret grew old enough to ask about the old stories still occasionally whispered in the village regarding the once cursed Duke of Ravenswood, Alastair would take her small hand gently in his own, walk her through the fully restored rose garden behind their home, and tell her honestly that curses, real as they might sometimes feel, were rarely as powerful as the courage and love capable of breaking them entirely, provided two people remained brave enough to hold on to each other through every storm life sent their way. And Alina, watching them together from the garden bench where her own life had changed so profoundly one autumn afternoon years before, would smile quietly to herself, grateful beyond words for the storm that had once stranded her at a stranger's gate, and for the hand that had reached back toward her through fire and fear alike, changing both their fates forever, exactly as it always seemed destined to do. Charlotte visited often over the following years, her relationship with her father slowly, carefully mending during his years of imprisonment, her own life eventually finding new direction as she took on the role of managing correspondence and accounts for the growing Ravenswood estate, a position Alastair offered freely once trust between them had been fully and genuinely established. Gerald, upon his eventual release, chose to settle quietly in a small cottage near the edge of the estate rather than return to London, spending his remaining years in humble, honest work among the very tenant farms his earlier schemes had once threatened to destabilize, finding in that simple labor a measure of peace he had never known during his years of desperate ambition. Peter eventually married the young kitchen maid Ruth, whose earlier involvement in the poisoning had been forgiven entirely once the full truth of Victor's manipulation became clear, the household coming to understand that fear and desperate circumstance, not malice, had driven her initial, regrettable choice. Their wedding, held in the same modest village chapel where Alastair and Alina had spoken their own vows, became something of a quiet symbol throughout Ashford Vale, proof that even those who had stumbled through difficult circumstances might yet find their way toward genuine happiness given patience, forgiveness, and honest effort. Edmund remained at Ravenswood Hall until his own retirement many years later, watching with quiet, private pride as the household he had served through its darkest years gradually transformed into one of the county's most respected and beloved estates, known not for old rumors of curses and tragedy, but for the warmth and generosity of the family who called it home. Hilda, too, remained for many years, teaching young Margaret to bake bread in the very kitchens where fire had once threatened everything the family held dear, filling those same rooms instead with the comforting smell of fresh bread and the sound of a child's delighted laughter. As for the old rose garden, it continued blooming more beautifully with each passing season, tended now not out of grief or guilt, but out of genuine love and careful attention, exactly as Alina had once observed it deserved. Alistair often found himself there in quiet moments throughout the years that followed, sometimes alone with his thoughts, more often with Alina beside him, or later, with their growing children playing happily among the fragrant blooms, and he would think each time of how close he had once come to spending his entire life locked away from exactly this kind of simple, precious joy. The storm that had once seemed like nothing more than a dangerous inconvenience, stranding a stranger at his gates on a night he had wished only to be left alone with his grief, had proven instead to be the beginning of everything truly worth having in his life. And whenever autumn storms rolled once more across the hills surrounding Ravenswood Hall, Alistair would find himself standing at the same study window where he had first watched Alina arrive so many years before, no longer with fear or dread, but with quiet, grateful wonder at the strange, unpredictable ways that fate, chosen bravely rather than simply feared, could transform even the darkest curse into the greatest blessing a man could ever hope to receive.